My name is Abigail. I am 28 years old. 3 weeks ago, my Aunt Diane looked me straight in the face and told me that because I was young and unmarried, I did not deserve the luxury vacation I had spent 2 years saving for. She stood in my mother kitchen, clutching a designer handbag she could no longer afford, and told me her college-age children needed a tropical getaway more than my exhausted, overworked mother did. I did not argue with her. I did not yell. I simply watched my aunt pack her bags for Maui, knowing she had drained my frequent flyer account to buy the tickets and stuck me with the bill. But as I stood on my balcony in the freezing Seattle rain yesterday morning sipping black coffee, my phone rang. It was Diane. She was not calling from a white sand beach in Hawaii with a drink in her hand. She was screaming in sheer, unadulterated terror over the howling sub-zero winds of the Arctic Circle. I stood there and listened to her panic as she realized her stolen tropical paradise was actually a frozen tundra. Then I took a sip of my coffee and hung up the phone. Before I tell you exactly how I sent the woman who robbed me into a frozen nightmare, take a second to like and subscribe to Sophie Tells Stories and drop a comment telling me your age, where you are watching from, and what time it is right now. Have you ever watched someone claim the rewards of your hard work, convinced they deserve it more than you do? If entitlement has ever ruined a family bond in your life, you will want to hear every detail of this. To understand how my aunt ended up shivering in the northernmost village in America, we have to go back to the beginning. I work as a supply chain analyst for a major seafood distributor located in Pioneer Square. My job revolves around moving thousands of pounds of perishable cargo across complex maritime routes. It means 60-hour work weeks, tracking refrigerated shipping containers, managing supply shortages, and dealing with the perpetual bone-chilling gray dampness of the Pacific Northwest winter. The stress is a constant hum in the background of my life. My eyes constantly burn from staring at logistics software, and my phone never stops ringing with delays from the port. For 2 years, I lived on a strict, unrelenting budget. I skipped dinners out with coworkers. I ignored the expensive coffee shops near my office, opting for the bitter drip coffee in the break room. I hoarded every single frequent flyer mile I earned, from grueling corporate travel sleeping in airport terminals to ensure I hit my loyalty tiers. My goal was singular and deeply personal. My mother had worked double shifts as a physical therapist for decades to keep a roof over my head after my father passed away. She spent her days lifting patients, bending over treatment tables, and absorbing the physical pain of others. She had bad knees, a tired back, and a lifelong dream of seeing the Pacific Ocean from a beach that did not require a heavy raincoat. I was determined to give her that experience. By mid-November, I had accumulated enough miles to cover the exorbitant last-minute booking fees and secure 2 luxury, non-refundable tickets to Maui. I even bought my mother a heavy, high-end winter coat to endure the Seattle drizzle in the weeks leading up to the departure. I handed her the coat in a gift box, a quiet, physical promise that the biting cold would soon be behind us. The itinerary was a masterpiece of careful planning, a tropical escape earned through sheer exhaustion and discipline. I revealed the surprise during our routine Sunday family potluck. My mother lives in a modest, single-story ranch house in the suburbs. It is a cozy space, always smelling of roasted chicken and fresh rosemary on the weekends. Aunt Diane and Uncle Greg arrived 20 minutes late to the dinner, a habit Diane cultivated for years to ensure she made a proper entrance. Diane lived in Bellevue, an affluent suburb across the water, known for pristine lawns and aggressive homeowners associations. She spent her life obsessing over status symbols. She drove a leased luxury SUV, wore shoes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and spoke to service workers with a sharp, clipped impatience. She curated an image of effortless wealth that she demanded the rest of the family respect. Greg followed her into the kitchen that Sunday, carrying a store-bought salad. He looked gray and diminished. He had run an independent contracting business for 15 years, but a series of bad bids and a shifting housing market had forced him to close his doors just 2 months prior. The financial strain was carving deep, exhausted lines into his face. He moved slowly, as if the air around him had grown thick and heavy. Diane, however, refused to scale back or acknowledge their new reality. She demanded the illusion of wealth be maintained at all costs, especially for their 2 college-age children who were currently away at an expensive out-of-state university. She carried on as if the foreclosure notices were merely clerical errors. We gathered around the dining room table. I poured the wine, waiting for a lull in Diane complaining about the rising cost of organic produce and the lack of decent landscaping services in her neighborhood. When the moment arrived, I pulled a colorful, glossy travel brochure from my bag and set it gently next to my mother plate. "Pack your bags, Mom," I said, a genuine smile breaking across my face. "We are spending 10 days in Maui." My mother picked up the brochure. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the resort name and the flight itinerary printed on the inside flap. Tears pooled in her eyes, spilling over her lashes. She stood up, walked around the table, and wrapped her arms around my neck. She squeezed tight, thanking me over and over, her voice thick with emotion. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered joy. I glanced across the table, expecting the rest of the family to share the celebration. Diane was not smiling. Her jaw was set hard, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. She gripped the stem of her wine glass so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. She looked at the glossy photos of the Hawaiian beaches on the brochure, then shifted her gaze to me, her eyes dark with bitter resentment. Maui Diane stated her tone flat and devoid of warmth. That must have cost a fortune. I used my frequent flyer miles, I explained, keeping my voice light, attempting to diffuse the sudden chill radiating from her side of the table. "I have been saving them up from work trips for 2 years. "How nice for you," she replied, picking up her fork and stabbing a piece of roasted potato with unnecessary force. "Some of us are struggling to keep a roof over our heads in this economy, and others get to jet off to the tropics on corporate perks." "Diane, please," Greg murmured. He kept his head down, staring at his plate, looking like a man who just wanted the ground to open up and swallow him. "Let them enjoy it." "I am just saying," Diane snapped, setting her fork down with a sharp clatter that made my mother flinch. "It must be nice to have no real responsibilities, no mortgage crisis, no tuition bills, just free vacations while the rest of us drown." The tension in the room thickened, suffocating the brief joy of the surprise. My mother looked down at her lap, the light fading from her eyes as she absorbed her sister's bitter jealousy. Diane had a remarkable talent for sucking the oxygen out of a room whenever the attention shifted away from her own life. She could not stand witnessing someone else experience a victory she felt she deserved. Diane stood up from the table, grabbed her wine glass, and walked over to the sliding glass door leading to the back patio. Outside, the Seattle rain fell in a steady gray sheet, slicking the concrete and weighing down the dark green pine branches. She stared out at the dismal weather, her reflection harsh and unyielding against the wet glass. "I hate this state," Diane hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "I hate the damp. I hate the gray. I hate waking up every morning to this freezing, miserable rain." She turned around, her expression hardened by a deep, ugly entitlement. She looked at the Maui brochure resting on the table, a stark contrast to the dreary weather beating against the glass behind her. "I would do anything to get out of here," Diane declared, her voice dropping into a low, resentful register. "I would do anything to be trapped anywhere that isn't freezing." I watched my aunt sip her wine, unaware of the profound irony her words would soon carry. She felt the world owed her a sunny escape simply because she desired it. She believed her self-inflicted financial burdens elevated her needs above my hard work and my mother-tired bones. I did not argue with her. I let the comment slide, eager to finish the meal and take my mother home. I had no idea that Diane was already formulating a plan to take what she felt she was owed. I did not realize that her offhand complaint about the freezing weather was about to become the exact blueprint for her own devastating punishment. I simply cleared the plates, assuming the worst part of the evening was over, leaving my laptop sitting unprotected on the kitchen island. The following Sunday, my mother hosted another afternoon gathering. The house was loud, filled with the clatter of silverware and the rich smell of simmering chili. I sat at the kitchen island nursing a glass of iced tea while scrolling through maritime shipping reports on my laptop. The logistics industry does not pause for weekends. Cargo ships idle at the port, accruing staggering demurrage fees by the hour if the import paperwork stalls. I typed a quick response to a freight forwarder trying to clear my inbox before the dinner began in earnest. Diane stood by the back door, pacing the narrow stretch of hardwood floor. She held her phone tightly against her ear, speaking in a harsh, hushed whisper. I could not hear the entire conversation, but the defensive tone was unmistakable. She was talking to her daughter, promising a spectacular winter break. She reassured the college student that the rumors spreading around their social circle regarding Greg losing his contracting business were just jealous gossip. Diane smoothed the fabric of her cashmere sweater, adjusting a garment she had purchased on credit months ago. The facade she had built over 2 decades was fracturing. The relentless pressure to maintain the illusion of unbothered wealth was pushing her toward a steep precipice. She ended the call and shoved the phone into her designer pocket. Her eyes darted around the kitchen, landing on my open laptop. The screen displayed my work email, but adjacent to it, another browser tab sat active. It was the airline portal featuring a vibrant banner advertising tropical getaways. I had logged in earlier that morning to check the seating chart for my upcoming flight with my mother, ensuring we were seated together near the front of the cabin. My mother called my name from the dining room, asking for help carrying a heavy ceramic serving dish. I pushed my chair back, leaving the laptop illuminated on the granite island. I walked away, leaving my digital life exposed. Diane did not use my laptop. Approaching the kitchen island would be too risky. My mother was arranging plates just a few feet away in the dining room, and I was moving back and forth carrying serving spoons. Instead, Diane retreated to the enclosed sunroom at the back of the house. Greg was dozing in a wicker armchair, exhausted from another week of fielding brutal calls from angry creditors. Resting on the glass side table next to him was his silver iPad. It was an older device, one he previously used to draft contractor bids before the bank seized his commercial assets. Diane picked it up. She sat on the edge of a floral sofa, shielded from the rest of the house by large potted ferns, and opened the web browser. 2 years ago, our family flew to Portland for a weekend estate sale. Diane insisted on managing the rental car reservation, but claimed she could not access the confirmation email on her phone. I texted her my frequent flyer login credentials so she could retrieve the barcode at the rental counter. I never bothered to change the password afterward. It was a mundane detail, a string of letters and numbers I thought meant nothing. To a woman desperate to maintain a crumbling illusion, it was the key to a vault. Diane typed the airline web address into the iPad. She entered my email and the old password. The portal loaded, displaying a digital welcome message and a staggering balance of hoarded frequent flyer miles. She navigated directly to my upcoming Maui itinerary. Her initial plan was simple. She intended to click the passenger modification tab, erase my name and my mother name, and type in her own family details. She quickly discovered that commercial airlines do not operate like local bus terminals. The system flashed a stark red error message across the screen. Non-refundable basic economy tickets cannot be transferred to different individuals. The names on the original booking were locked. She stared at the restriction. A rational person would have stopped there. A rational person would have accepted defeat and returned to the family dinner. Diane pivoted. The screen glowed in the dim sunroom, illuminating the cold calculation setting into her features. She returned to the main dashboard. She initiated a brand new flight search. She selected a route from Seattle to Maui, departing the exact same week in December. She chose 4 premium economy seats for herself, Greg, and their 2 children. She proceeded to the checkout screen. The airline system applied my entire balance of saved miles to cover the base fares. However, booking 4 premium tickets just weeks before the busy holiday travel season triggered exorbitant last-minute booking fees, fuel surcharges, and state taxes. The remaining balance displayed at the bottom of the screen was $6,000. Diane scrolled down to the payment section. My primary travel credit card was saved on file, authorized for seamless one-click purchases. She did not flinch. She did not pause to consider the financial devastation she was about to unleash on her own niece. She convinced herself that I was young, that I possessed a steady corporate salary, and that I could easily recover the funds over time. She told herself that Greg deserved one last victory lap before the reality of their bankruptcy became public knowledge. She justified the theft as a necessary survival tactic for her own family unit. Before she hit the final purchase button, she navigated to the account settings page. She deleted my personal email address from the contact information. She replaced it with a disposable random string of characters hosted on a free server. She ensured the purchase receipt and all upcoming flight alerts would bypass my inbox entirely, buying herself the crucial time needed to delay discovery. She returned to the checkout page. She tapped the bright blue confirm button. The screen buffered for 3 agonizing seconds. A small loading circle spun against a white background. Then a bold green checkmark appeared, followed by a 6-digit alphanumeric confirmation code. Diane exhaled a long, shaky breath. She cleared the browser history on the device, erasing her digital footprints. She placed the silver iPad back onto the glass table next to her sleeping husband. She smoothed her cashmere sweater one final time, stood up, and walked back into the dining room. She took her seat at the table, picked up her wine glass, and smiled at my mother. My 2 years of disciplined savings and my entire vacation budget were wiped out in 3 minutes. The trap had been set in silence, leaving me entirely unaware that my financial security had just been hollowed out from the inside. I ate my dinner laughing at a joke Greg made when he finally woke up, oblivious to the fact that the woman sitting across from me had just hijacked my dream and financed it with my credit. The betrayal sat dormant in the digital ether for 48 hours. I went to work on Monday and Tuesday, navigating complex shipping manifests and arguing with harbor masters over delayed cargo containers. I drank the bitter breakroom coffee and felt a quiet, persistent sense of satisfaction, knowing my mother was finally going to see the warm sand of the Pacific. I pictured the heavy winter coat I bought her sitting in her closet, a tangible promise of escape. On Wednesday morning, my phone buzzed on my desk. It was an automated text message from my primary credit card provider. Action required. Did you authorize a $6,000 transaction with Pacific Sky Airlines? Reply yes or no. I stopped typing. The cursor blinked steadily on my spreadsheet. A $6,000 charge. I stared at the screen, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. I had not booked any additional flights, and my original tickets were secured using frequent flyer miles, incurring only minor processing fees. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. I assumed it was a standard security glitch, a fraudulent charge originating from some anonymous server halfway across the world. I typed no and hit send. 30 seconds later, an automated phone call arrived from the bank fraud department. A robotic voice instructed me to log into my account to review recent activity. I opened a new browser tab and accessed my airline loyalty portal. I typed in my email address and my saved password. The screen buffered, displaying a red error message. Invalid login credentials. I tried again, typing slower. The same red message flashed across the screen. My stomach tightened. The routine annoyance of a forgotten password shifted into a cold, sharp spike of anxiety. I clicked the password reset link. The system prompted me to verify the email address associated with the account. A masked email address appeared on the screen, a bizarre string of random letters and numbers ending in a free server domain. It was not my email. I grabbed my phone and dialed the airline customer service line. After 10 agonizing minutes on hold listening to cheerful elevator music, a representative answered. I provided my account number, my birth date, and the last 4 digits of my social security number to verify my identity. Ma'am, the representative said, her tone polite but detached. I see an account modification was processed on Sunday afternoon. The contact email was changed and a new itinerary was booked. What itinerary? I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I only have 2 tickets booked for Maui. The representative paused, the sound of keyboard clicking echoing over the line. I am looking at the active reservations. Your original 2 tickets to Maui were canceled. The miles were refunded and immediately applied toward a new booking. The current itinerary lists 4 passengers traveling to Maui on the same dates. The passengers are Diane Gregory and 2 other names I can confirm if you need them. My lungs forgot how to draw air. The bustling noise of the logistics office faded into a dull roar. The names hit me with the force of a physical blow. Diane, my aunt, the woman who stood in my mother's kitchen just days ago and complained about the freezing weather, the woman who glared at my travel brochure with undisguised contempt. She did not just steal my money, she stole my entire vacation. I ended the call without thanking the representative. I did not log out of my computer. I stood up from my desk, grabbed my purse, and walked out of the office. I navigated the busy Seattle streets blindly, the gray drizzle slicking the pavement, acting entirely on a visceral, blinding surge of adrenaline. I drove back to my apartment, slamming the front door behind me. I threw my purse onto the kitchen counter and dialed Diane's number. The phone rang 4 times. She picked up on the 5th ring. Hello? She answered, her voice carrying a cheerful, artificial lilt. "You stole my miles!" I yelled, bypassing any greeting. My voice shook violently, tearing out of my throat in a raw, frantic pitch. "You logged into my account, canceled my mother's trip, and used my credit card to buy tickets for your family." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. I expected denial. I expected her to play dumb, to claim her account was hacked, or to invent some convoluted excuse blaming a travel agency error. I did not expect the icy, unapologetic tone that followed. "Calm down," Abigail Diane commanded. Her voice did not shake. She sounded entirely unbothered, annoyed that I was raising my voice. "It is not a big deal. You are overreacting." "Overreacting," I screamed, pacing across my small kitchen. "You committed wire fraud, Diane. You stole $6,000 from me and wiped out 2 years of savings. You took my mother's vacation." "Your mother can go to a beach any time," Diane snapped back, her patience evaporating. "She has a house. She has a steady pension. Greg is losing everything, Abigail. The bank is taking his business. He is a broken man. Do you have any idea what it is like for my kids to watch their father fail? They need this trip. They deserve one last beautiful memory as a family before the reality of bankruptcy hits them." I stopped pacing. The sheer audacity of her justification paralyzed me. She was weaponizing her husband's financial failure to validate grand larceny. She genuinely believed her desire to maintain an illusion of wealth superseded my right to the money I had earned. "You are young." Diane continued, adopting a patronizing, soothing tone that made my skin crawl. "You have a great corporate job. You can rebuild those miles in a few months. Greg and I do not have that kind of time. We need this win. We are family, Abigail. Families make sacrifices for each other." The word sacrifice hung in the air, a toxic, heavy demand. The sound of that word triggered a jarring, vivid memory from 12 years ago. I was 16 years old, sitting on the bottom step of my grandmother's staircase. Diane was in the living room, crying hysterically, demanding money to cover the catering costs for a lavish wedding she was throwing for her oldest child. She had maxed out her own credit lines. My grandmother, a kind but easily manipulated woman, agreed to cash out a small, high-yield savings bond she had started for my college tuition. Diane took the check, wiped her tears, and walked out the door without a second glance at me. I watched Diane siphon resources from my family for over a decade. She built her entire affluent facade by draining the goodwill of the people around her. It was a lifelong pattern of parasitic entitlement, and I was just the latest host. "I will not be your sacrifice, Diane." I choked out my chest, heaving as I gasped for air. "Cancel the tickets. Call the airline right now, cancel the booking, and refund my credit card." "I cannot do that," she replied flatly. "They are non-refundable tickets. I deliberately booked the basic economy tier to keep the taxes lower. The airline will not issue a refund, and I certainly do not have $6,000 in cash to pay you back." She had engineered the trap perfectly. She locked the funds into an unalterable airline contract, ensuring I could not simply reverse the transaction without losing the entire amount. "Just let it go," Abigail Diane instructed, her voice devoid of any empathy. "Think of it as a gift to your uncle. Have a good afternoon." The line clicked dead. I stood in my kitchen clutching the phone. My entire body trembled with a chaotic, violent energy. I did not deliver a stoic, perfect monologue. I did not take a deep breath and immediately formulate a brilliant counter-strategy. The emotional dam I had built to survive the stress of my job and the pressure of saving for this trip shattered completely. I hyperventilated, drawing short, ragged breaths that provided no oxygen. I dropped my phone onto the laminate countertop. I grabbed my heavy ceramic coffee mug, the one sitting next to the sink, still half full of bitter morning coffee. I hurled the mug across the room with all the strength I possessed. It smashed against the drywall above the trash can. The heavy ceramic exploded into dozens of sharp, jagged pieces, raining down onto the linoleum floor in a loud, chaotic crash. Dark brown coffee splashed across the white paint, dripping slowly down the wall in jagged, messy lines. I sank down onto the floor, pulling my knees to my chest, sobbing openly among the shattered ceramic. The anger was raw, ugly, and entirely unfiltered. I was broken, furious, and stranded holding a massive credit card debt while the woman who robbed me packed her bags for paradise. I cried until my throat ached, surrounded by the mess, realizing the airline policies designed to protect the corporation had just been weaponized against me. I needed to figure out how to navigate the bureaucratic maze of credit card disputes and airline regulations, and I knew the fight was going to be excruciatingly slow. I spent the next 2 hours cleaning the shattered ceramic off my kitchen floor, sweeping the jagged shards into a dustpan, while the adrenaline slowly drained from my system. The coffee stain on the drywall refused to come out, leaving a faint brown shadow that mocked my emotional breakdown. Once the kitchen was clean, the reality of the bureaucratic nightmare settled over me. I sat down at my small dining table, booted up my laptop, and dialed the fraud department of my credit card company. I expected a swift resolution. I assumed the bank would recognize the unauthorized IP address flag the massive charge and issue an immediate chargeback. I was naive to the grinding, cynical machinery of financial institutions. After verifying my identity, I explained the situation to a fraud investigator. I detailed the unauthorized login, the stolen frequent flyer miles, and the $6,000 charge for taxes and fees. The investigator typed methodically, his voice devoid of any inflection. "Ms. Abigail," he began outlining the corporate policy with agonizing precision. "Can you confirm if the individual who initiated this transaction is a relative?" "Yes," I replied, a sinking feeling taking hold. "She is my aunt." "And has she ever been authorized to use this specific credit card or frequent flyer account in the past?" he asked, zeroing in on the crucial detail. I hesitated. "Well, yes. 2 years ago, I gave her the password to retrieve a rental car reservation during a family trip. But that was for a specific, isolated event. I did not authorize this purchase." The typing on the other end of the line stopped. "I understand your frustration," the investigator stated, his tone shifting from helpful to bureaucratic. "However, because the transaction was initiated by a known family member who previously possessed authorized access credentials, we cannot immediately classify this as hostile identity theft. This falls under the category of a familial civil dispute." My chest tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means we cannot issue an immediate provisional credit or a chargeback," he explained. "We must initiate a formal investigation. We will require police reports, sworn affidavits, and potentially court orders to compel the airline to release the funds. The standard timeline for a familial dispute investigation is up to 90 days. Until the investigation concludes, you remain liable for the balance on the account." 90 days. 3 months of carrying a $6,000 debt with a punishing 24% interest rate. 3 months of waiting while Diane packed her designer bags and flew to the tropics on my dime. I ended the call and immediately dialed the airline's customer service escalation line. If the bank would not stop the transaction, I needed the airline to cancel the tickets. I spent another 40 minutes navigating automated menus and explaining my situation to 3 different supervisors. The final manager I spoke with was sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful. "I see the fraud flag on the account," the manager confirmed, "but your aunt intentionally booked the basic economy fare class. Those tickets are strictly non-refundable and non-transferable. We cannot issue a cash refund, and we cannot reinstate the frequent flyer miles once they are converted into a confirmed itinerary. The only option is to cancel the flights and issue an e-credit for future travel." "Can you issue the e-credit in my name?" I asked desperately. "I paid for the taxes. They are my miles." "No," she replied firmly. "Federal aviation regulations mandate that any e-credit generated from a canceled flight must remain in the name of the ticketed passenger. If you cancel this itinerary, the credit stays in Diane's name. You would essentially be gifting her $6,000 in free flights to use whenever she pleases." She had built the trap flawlessly. Diane had weaponized the rigid, inflexible rules of commercial aviation to secure her stolen prize. By exploiting the basic economy restrictions and leveraging her status as a family member, she had locked the funds in a bureaucratic vault that neither the bank nor the airline would open. I was out $6,000, my credit utilization was dangerously high, and my mother was never going to see the beaches of Maui. I sat in my dark apartment staring at the glow of my laptop screen. The sheer injustice of the situation was a heavy, suffocating weight. Diane was going to win. She was going to enjoy a luxury vacation, and I was going to spend the next 90 days fighting a financial institution just to clear my name. I pulled up my work email seeking a distraction from the rising panic. As a supply chain analyst, my entire career is built on identifying logistical bottlenecks, finding alternate shipping routes, and manipulating complex tracking software to ensure cargo reaches its destination. I spend 60 hours a week navigating rigid corporate systems to find the hidden loopholes. I stared at the maritime routing software on my screen, watching the green icons representing cargo ships moving across the Pacific. An idea began to form. It started as a tiny chaotic spark, a ridiculous scenario that quickly solidified into a viable tactical strategy. I opened a new browser tab and navigated back to the airline's loyalty portal. I typed in my email address and the new password I had created after discovering the theft. The dashboard loaded, displaying my name as the primary account holder. Diane had booked the tickets under her own name, but she had used my established loyalty profile to process the transaction. Because the miles belonged to my profile, the overarching reservation was permanently tethered to my administrative account. I was the master account holder. I clicked on the Active Itineraries tab. Diane's flight schedule appeared on the screen. Seattle to Anchorage, a short layover. Anchorage to Honolulu, Maui. I clicked the passenger details section. As the customer service manager had warned, the names were grayed out and locked. I could not change Diane into Abigail. I clicked the Cancel Reservation button. A warning prompt appeared, reiterating that a cancellation would generate an e-credit exclusively in the names of the ticketed passengers. I closed the warning prompt. I did not want to cancel the flights. I wanted to modify the logistics. I clicked the Modify Itinerary button. The screen buffered for 2 seconds, a loading circle spinning against the white background. Then a new menu appeared, offering options to change flight times, upgrade seating classes, or alter the final destination. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Because I retained administrative control over the master loyalty account, I possessed the digital authority to alter the routing of the cargo. The passengers were locked, but the destination was not. I selected the final leg of the journey, the flight from Anchorage to Maui. I clicked the Change Destination tab. A search bar appeared, prompting me to enter a new airport code. I opened a new window and searched for commercial airports in the state of Alaska. I bypassed Juneau. I bypassed Fairbanks. I scrolled past the tourist destinations and the coastal fishing towns, driving deep into the remote, unforgiving interior of the state. I searched for the harshest, most isolated commercial airstrip I could find. I found it at the very top of the map. Utqiagvik, Alaska, formerly known as Barrow. It is the northernmost city in the United States, located entirely above the Arctic Circle. It is a bleak, frozen expanse of tundra, accessible only by plane, plagued by sub-zero temperatures, brutal winds, and prolonged periods of total darkness. I typed the airport code BRW into the airline portal. The system processed the request. It generated a new flight path: Seattle to Anchorage, a 3-hour layover. Anchorage to Utqiagvik. A final payment screen appeared. Rerouting a flight at the last minute incurs significant change fees and fare differences. The total cost to modify the itinerary for 4 passengers was $1,400. I did not have $1,400 in my checking account. I pulled out my backup credit card, the one I kept strictly for emergencies, the one with a 0 balance. I typed the 16 digits into the payment field. I was plunging myself further into debt, but the investment felt entirely justified. I was not buying a vacation. I was purchasing retribution. I clicked the Confirm Modification button. The system processed the payment. A bright green checkmark appeared on the screen, accompanied by a new 6-digit confirmation code. I navigated to the notification settings. I ensured the email alerts were still directing to the dummy address Diane had created. She would not receive a notification regarding the change. When she checked in at the kiosk at SeaTac Airport, the boarding passes would only display the initial leg of the journey, Seattle to Anchorage. The final destination would remain obscured until they boarded their connecting flight in Alaska. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. The tears were gone. The hyperventilation had stopped. I had executed a flawless logistical reroute. Diane believed she had stolen a tropical paradise, wrapping her theft in a cloak of arrogant entitlement. She had no idea she was currently holding 4 non-refundable tickets to a frozen wasteland, and the departure date was approaching with the quiet, inevitable certainty of a freight train. I had armed the trap. All I had to do now was wait for her to step onto the plane. The 2 weeks leading up to the departure date felt like moving through wet concrete. I maintained absolute radio silence with Diane. I ignored her occasional baiting text messages, asking if I had managed to cool off. I refused to answer my mother's anxious daily phone calls. My mother, caught between her sister's aggressive entitlement and my sudden profound withdrawal, was desperate to broker a peace that did not exist. I could not speak to her without risking the exposure of my operation. To ensure the trap remained concealed, I had to play the role of the defeated, humiliated niece perfectly. I had to let them believe the theft had succeeded. The morning of their flight arrived on a Thursday in mid-December. The weather in Seattle was characteristically miserable. A thick, heavy fog blanketed the Puget Sound, and an icy, unrelenting rain slicked the streets of Pioneer Square. I called into work taking a personal day. I could not focus on maritime shipping schedules when I had a much more pressing logistical maneuver to monitor. I sat at my dining room table, a fresh pot of black coffee steaming next to my open laptop. I had 2 browser windows active. One displayed the live flight tracking map on the airline portal. The other was logged into Facebook. I knew Diane. I knew her pathological need for external validation. She would not be able to resist broadcasting her stolen luxury vacation to her affluent Bellevue neighbors and her carefully curated list of social media acquaintances. At 8:15 in the morning, her first post appeared on my feed. It was a group selfie taken in the departures drop-off zone at SeaTac Airport. The 4 of them stood huddled under the concrete awning shielded from the freezing Seattle rain. The visual contrast was jarring. While the other passengers in the background wore heavy parkas and woolen scarves, Diane's family was dressed aggressively for the tropics. Uncle Greg wore khaki cargo shorts and a bright oversized floral button-down shirt. The 2 college-aged kids wore expensive designer sunglasses, tank tops, and strappy leather sandals. Diane stood in the center sporting a wide-brimmed straw sun hat and a thin, gauzy linen resort dress that offered zero insulation against the 40-degree morning chill. They were freezing, shivering slightly in the damp airport draft, but they were grinning wide for the camera. They were enduring the temporary discomfort, fully confident they were just hours away from warm Pacific breezes. The caption read, "Escaping the dreary Pacific Northwest for some well-earned family time. Aloha." I stared at the photograph. The dramatic irony was a heavy, intoxicating presence in my quiet apartment. They were standing in front of an airport terminal, posing in beachwear, carrying luggage filled entirely with swimsuit, sunscreen, and light linen clothing. They had no idea they were dressed for a tropical paradise, while actively walking toward a boarding gate that would eventually deposit them onto a frozen sub-zero tundra. The sheer arrogance radiating from the photograph fueled my resolve. I did not feel a shred of guilt. At 9:30, a second post materialized. This one was a solo shot of Diane sitting in the exclusive first-class airline lounge. She held a tall, crystal flute filled with a bright orange mimosa toasting the camera. Her straw hat rested on the table next to an expensive leather carry-on bag. The caption was a masterclass in passive-aggressive gloating. Sometimes after a hard year, you just have to take the vacation you deserve. #blessed, #island time. I took a slow sip of my coffee. "You deserve exactly what you are about to get," I whispered to the empty room. I switched over to the airline portal. Because my master account profile was tied to the reservation, I received real-time push notifications regarding the itinerary's status. The system pinged, confirming that 4 passengers had successfully checked in at the kiosk and checked their luggage. The bags packed entirely with summer resort wear were now tumbling down the conveyor belts into the belly of the aircraft. I clicked on the boarding pass details. The system had generated their mobile passes perfectly, reflecting the initial leg of the journey exactly as I had planned. The passes displayed a direct flight from Seattle to Anchorage, Alaska. For travelers flying from the Pacific Northwest to Hawaii, a layover in Anchorage or Portland is a common standard routing procedure used by several major airlines. It would not raise any red flags for Diane or Greg. They assumed they were simply stopping to refuel or switch crews before turning south toward the Hawaiian Islands. They were comfortably ignorant of the fact that the second boarding pass, the one that would only generate once they landed in Anchorage, contained a drastically different destination code. At 10:15, the final notification arrived. Flight boarding complete. Doors secured. I watched the live flight map on my screen. A small blue airplane icon appeared on the runway at SeaTac. The icon remained stationary for a few agonizing minutes as the aircraft taxied into position. Then the status changed to airborne. The blue icon began to move. It drifted slowly off the Seattle coast, banking over the gray waters of the Puget Sound. I sat in my dark apartment, the only illumination coming from the harsh glow of the laptop screen. I watched the icon trace a steady, unwavering line. It did not turn west toward the warm expanse of the Pacific Ocean. It did not angle south toward the tropical latitudes. The little blue airplane moved relentlessly north. It flew over the rugged coastline of British Columbia. It crossed into the vast frozen airspace of the Alaskan Panhandle. Every inch the icon moved represented a drop in temperature outside the aircraft cabin. Every mile took Diane further away from her stolen paradise and deeper into the trap I had carefully constructed. She was currently sitting in a pressurized cabin, sipping complimentary beverages, wearing a linen dress and a straw hat, entirely unaware that she was hurtling toward a destination where the ground was permanently frozen. She believed she had successfully outsmarted me, weaponizing family guilt and airline bureaucracy to secure her unearned prize. She was sleeping soundly, dreaming of white sand and palm trees insulated by her own profound entitlement. I did not close the laptop. I sat there for 3.5 hours, tracking the icon until it began its descent toward the Anchorage airport for the scheduled layover. The first phase of the operation was complete. They were on the ground in Alaska. The trap had officially snapped shut. The only thing left to do was wait for them to board the connecting flight and for the pilot to announce their true final destination. The notification chimed on my laptop at exactly 4:20 in the afternoon. The connecting flight had departed Anchorage on schedule. The blue airplane icon resumed its journey on the digital map, moving steadily away from the relative civilization of southern Alaska and driving deep into the harsh, unforgiving interior of the Arctic Circle. I watched the icon cross the Brooks Range, venturing into airspace where commercial flights are sparse and the terrain below is a desolate frozen expanse. I imagined the scene inside the cabin. Diane and her family were likely exhausted from the travel day. The initial excitement of the airport lounge had probably worn off, replaced by the dull fatigue of recycled cabin air and cramped seating. I pictured them dozing in their premium economy seats, bundled under thin airline blankets, their summer attire offering no real warmth. They were sleeping through the journey, trusting the airline logistics to deliver them to the beaches of Maui. They had no reason to scrutinize the flight path. They were comfortably insulated by their own arrogance. At 7:15 that evening, the blue icon on my screen began to blink, indicating the aircraft had initiated its final descent. I closed my laptop and walked away from the dining table. The digital tracking was no longer necessary. The physical reality of the trap was about to execute itself. I walked into my kitchen, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and stepped out onto the small balcony of my apartment. The relentless Seattle rain had settled into a steady, freezing drizzle. I leaned against the cold metal railing, watching the headlights of the cars on the street below smear against the wet pavement. I took a sip of the bitter coffee, waiting for the inevitable phone call. I knew exactly how the realization would unfold on the aircraft. The initial descent would pull Diane from her sleep. She would stretch, adjusting her linen dress, preparing to gather her belongings for a tropical arrival. The chime of the public address system would echo through the cabin. The pilot's voice would crackle over the speakers, delivering the standard pre-arrival briefing. Ladies and gentlemen from the flight deck, we have begun our initial descent into Utqiagvik. We are expecting a smooth touchdown in about 20 minutes. For those of you checking the local weather wrap-up warm, we are currently sitting at 14 degrees below zero, with a sustained wind chill dropping the feels-like temperature closer to -35. Local time is... Diane would freeze. The words Utqiagvik and -35 would clash violently with her expectation of Honolulu and 80 degrees. She would likely turn to Greg, assuming she had misheard the announcement through the hazy fog of sleep. Greg, wearing his floral cargo shorts, would look equally confused. Diane would raise her window shade, expecting to see the deep blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean or the lush green slopes of the Hawaiian Islands. Instead, she would look out the small oval window and see nothing. Utqiagvik, Alaska, in mid-December, experiences polar night. The sun does not rise above the horizon for 65 consecutive days. She would not see an ocean or palm trees. She would look out into a profound, suffocating darkness, broken only by the harsh glare of the aircraft landing lights reflecting off a vast, endless sea of jagged sea ice and frozen tundra. She would assume it was an emergency. She would rationalize that the plane had encountered a catastrophic mechanical failure over the ocean and was forced to divert to a frozen military outpost. She would demand answers from a flight attendant, her voice rising in panic. The flight attendant, checking the manifest, would politely inform her that this was not a diversion. Flight 184 was a scheduled commercial route, and Utqiagvik was the ticketed final destination for all passengers in her row. The reality of the situation would hit her with the physical force of a sledgehammer. She was not in Hawaii. She was not anywhere near the tropics. She was landing in the northernmost settlement in North America, a place where the ocean freezes solid and the wind cuts through bone. And all 4 of her family members were wearing sandals and shorts. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. The screen illuminated, cutting through the dark dampness of the balcony. The caller ID displayed Diane's name. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the shrill sound cutting through the Seattle rain. I pressed the green accept button and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not speak. I let the silence stretch across the thousands of miles separating us. Abigail. Diane's voice exploded through the tiny speaker. It was not her usual sharp, commanding tone. It was a raw, hysterical shriek, vibrating with pure, unadulterated terror. The background noise on her end of the line was chaotic. I could hear the roar of the jet engine spooling down and the frantic, heavy rustle of passengers gathering winter gear. Underneath it all, I could hear the howling, ferocious scream of the Arctic wind battering the thin aluminum hull of the aircraft. "Abigail, what did you do?" Diane screamed, her voice cracking. "Where are we?" The pilot said it is 14 degrees below zero. We are landing on ice. Greg is in shorts. My kids are in sandals. There are no palm trees. Where did you send us? I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The hot liquid warmed my chest, offering a stark contrast to the freezing drizzle hitting my face and the sub-zero panic radiating from the phone. "I sent you exactly where you asked to go." "Aunt Diane," I replied. My voice was calm, level, and entirely devoid of empathy. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. "What are you talking about?" she sobbed, the panic devolving into frantic weeping. I booked tickets to Maui. The itinerary said Maui. I checked it myself." "You checked the initial booking," Diane, I corrected smoothly. "But you used my frequent flyer profile to steal those tickets, which means I remained the account administrator. I could not change the passenger names back to my mother and me. Airline security is very strict about that. But I could modify the final destination." There was a ragged intake of breath on the other end of the line. The realization of the trap finally penetrated her panic. "You rerouted the flight," she whispered, the horror, stark and absolute. "You stranded us here. I stood in my kitchen 3 weeks ago and listened to you justify grand larceny because you felt entitled to a vacation." I continued, my tone dropping into a cold, uncompromising register. "I listened to you weaponize Uncle Greg's failure to steal my mother's dream. And then I watched you stand by my sliding glass door and complain about the Seattle weather." I paused, letting the memory hang between us. "Do you remember what you said, Diane?" I asked quietly. She did not answer. I could hear her teeth chattering audibly over the phone. "You said you would do anything to get out of Washington," I reminded her, throwing her own words back like a weapon. "You explicitly stated you would do anything to be trapped anywhere that isn't freezing." A sharp, hysterical sob tore out of her throat. "So I fixed it for you." I concluded, my voice steady and cold. "I found the most freezing place on the continent. I hope you packed a heavy sweater. Have a wonderful, unforgettable family vacation." "Abigail, please, you cannot do this!" Diane shrieked, the reality of stepping off the plane in summer clothing finally hitting her. "We will freeze to death. The kids do not even have socks on. How do we get back? You have to fix this. Call the airline. Book us a flight back right now. I demand you fix this." I pulled the phone away from my ear, holding it out over the balcony railing. I let her frantic screams mingle with the sound of the Seattle rain hitting the pavement below. I did not offer a solution. I did not negotiate a return trip. I brought the phone back to my face, pressed the red button on the screen, and ended the call. The line went dead. The silence returned to my balcony clean and unbothered. I had successfully executed the reroute. The golden child and her entitled family were now standing on an icy tarmac at the top of the world, entirely unequipped for survival. If you caught someone stealing your dream, would you expose them, or would you send them into a freezing nightmare? Tell me your move in the comments, because Diane was about to realize how deep the ice goes, and the financial consequences of her theft were just beginning to thaw. The real trap had yet to spring shut. I stepped back inside my apartment, sliding the heavy glass balcony door shut, cutting off the sound of the freezing Seattle rain. I carried my empty coffee mug to the kitchen sink and placed it gently next to the faint brown stain still visible on the drywall. I leaned against the counter, my heart hammering a steady, methodical rhythm against my ribs. I had executed the trap, but the logistical reality of stranding a family in the Arctic Circle was about to trigger a frantic, desperate reaction. I needed to monitor the fallout because I knew Diane would not simply accept defeat. Utqiagvik is not a tourist destination equipped to handle stranded, unprepared travelers. It is a harsh, utilitarian settlement perched on the edge of the frozen Chukchi Sea. The infrastructure is designed for survival, not comfort. The local economy is driven by essential services, scientific research, and the oil industry. Accommodations are severely limited. The few small hotels operating in the village cater to contracted workers and researchers, and their nightly rates reflect the exorbitant cost of importing basic necessities to the top of the world. Diane and her family were currently standing inside the Wiley Post Will Rogers Memorial Airport. It is a small, functional terminal, entirely unequipped to house passengers for extended periods. They were wearing linen dresses, floral shirts, and sandals. The temperature outside the terminal walls was sitting at -14 degrees, plunging lower with every gust of the Arctic wind. They could not step outside to find a hotel. They could not walk to a store to buy heavy parkas. They were physically trapped inside the heated confines of the small airport building, surrounded by locals in heavy Carhartt gear and insulated boots who were likely staring at them with a mixture of confusion and profound pity. I walked over to my desk and opened my laptop. I pulled up the commercial flight schedules for flights departing Utqiagvik. Due to the extreme weather conditions and the remote location, commercial flights out of the village were infrequent. There were no immediate late-night return flights to Anchorage. The next available departure was scheduled for the following morning. Diane was a woman accustomed to solving problems by throwing money at them, particularly when the money did not belong to her. She was currently standing in a freezing terminal, panicking, realizing she needed to purchase 4 emergency last-minute, one-way tickets back to civilization. I knew exactly what she was going to do. She had already successfully utilized my saved credit card information stored within my frequent flyer account to pay the initial $6,000 in booking fees. In her sheer, unadulterated panic, she would assume she could exploit that exact same vulnerability to secure their rescue. She would attempt to access the airline portal on her phone and charge the emergency flights directly to my account. I did not have to wait long. 20 minutes after I hung up the phone, my cell phone vibrated violently on the kitchen counter. A bright red urgent push notification appeared on the screen. Fraud alert. A transaction of $3,840 has been attempted at Pacific Sky Airlines. Reply, yes, if authorized. Reply, no to decline. I stared at the notification. The audacity of the attempt was staggering. Even after discovering she had been trapped, even after realizing I knew exactly what she had done, her immediate reflex was to reach back into my wallet to fund her escape. Her entitlement was a deeply ingrained reflexive instinct. She believed her immediate discomfort superseded my financial security. She believed I would simply absorb another massive debt to prevent her children from sleeping on the floor of an Arctic terminal. I picked up the phone, I typed no, and hit send. The transaction was instantly declined. I did not stop there. I needed to sever her access entirely and permanently. I dialed the emergency 24-hour fraud hotline printed on the back of my credit card. When the representative answered, I bypassed the automated menus and immediately requested to speak with a senior security analyst. "My account has been compromised," I stated clearly, my voice cold and authoritative. "An unauthorized individual currently possesses my billing information and is actively attempting to initiate high-value transactions. I just declined a charge for nearly $4,000. I need you to initiate a hard security freeze on this account immediately. Cancel the current card number, issue a new one, and block any recurring or saved payment profiles associated with this line of credit." The analyst moved quickly, processing the request with urgent efficiency. Within 3 minutes, the account was locked down. The digital vault was sealed. The credit card Diane had relied upon as her endless interest-free funding source was now a useless string of dead numbers. I ended the call and set the phone down. I pictured the scene unfolding at the small ticketing counter in the Utqiagvik terminal. Diane shivering in her summer clothes, frantically tapping the screen of her phone, trying to force the payment through the airline portal. The red declined message flashing repeatedly. Her turning to Greg in escalating panic, realizing her stolen safety net had vanished. Without access to my credit line, they were forced to confront the reality of their own catastrophic financial situation. Greg's contracting business was bankrupt. Diane had maxed out their personal credit cards months ago to maintain the illusion of their Bellevue lifestyle. They did not have $4,000 in available credit to purchase the emergency flights. They did not have the funds to book a room at the overpriced local hotel. They were stranded broke and freezing. To escape the Arctic, Diane was forced to execute the one action she feared more than anything else. She was forced to publicly humiliate herself. Through the family grapevine, the details of her desperate scramble quickly filtered back to me. Standing in the middle of the terminal, surrounded by her shivering, confused children, Diane was forced to call her affluent neighbors in Bellevue and extended family members across Washington state. She had to beg for emergency wire transfers. She had to weave frantic, humiliating lies claiming they had been stranded due to an airline routing error and their wallets had been lost. She had to swallow her pride and beg for cash to buy their way out of the frozen nightmare she had orchestrated. I sat alone in my dark apartment watching the rain beat against the window pane, monitoring the situation from a distance. The initial surge of adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a complex, heavy emotional residue. I felt a sharp, undeniable sense of vindication. I had successfully defended myself against a parasitic theft. I had forced a woman who spent her life exploiting others to finally experience the paralyzing terror of financial desperation. She had tried to steal a luxury vacation, and instead she had secured a traumatizing lesson in consequence. But beneath the vindication, a profound, exhausting sadness took root. I thought about my cousins. They were college students, likely oblivious to the true extent of their parents' financial ruin and entirely ignorant of the fact that their mother had stolen their tickets. They had boarded that plane expecting sunshine and relaxation, only to be thrust into a terrifying sub-zero ordeal. They were collateral damage in a war they did not start. I felt a jagged pang of guilt for stranding them without heavy coats or boots, forcing them to sleep on the hard plastic chairs of the terminal while their mother begged for money. I had protected my boundaries, but the victory was messy and inherently destructive. The family dynamic, already strained by Diane's entitlement and Greg's failure, was now permanently fractured. The lines had been drawn, and there was no returning to the polite, superficial Sunday potlucks. I closed my laptop and turned off the kitchen light. The operation was complete. Diane had secured enough borrowed funds to purchase their return flights for the following morning. They would fly back to Seattle, humiliated, exhausted, and deeply in debt. I assumed the ordeal would force Diane to retreat to lick her wounds and accept the consequences of her theft in silence. I assumed she would realize she had finally pushed too far. I drastically underestimated the depth of her arrogance. I assumed the frozen trap would be the end of the conflict. I had no idea it was merely the opening skirmish, and the true devastating legal war was preparing to launch. The return journey from Utqiagvik was a grueling, humiliating ordeal for Diane and her family. They spent nearly 14 hours huddled in the tiny utilitarian airport terminal, shivering in their summer clothes, waiting for the morning departure. They subsisted on stale vending machine snacks and overpriced coffee. the grim reality of their situation settling over them like the heavy Arctic darkness outside. When they finally boarded the flight back to Anchorage and subsequently connected to Seattle, the affluent facade Diane had carefully maintained for decades was thoroughly shattered. They arrived at SeaTac Airport looking like refugees exhausted broke and indebted to the relatives who had wired them the emergency funds. I assumed the sheer humiliation of the experience would force Diane into a resentful, defeated silence. I believed the frozen trap had successfully neutralized her. I drastically underestimated the blinding power of her narcissism. Diane was a woman who could never accept fault. If she suffered a consequence, she immediately sought to identify an external villain to blame. Her entitlement demanded retribution. She needed to punish me for exposing her theft and destroying her illusion. 3 weeks passed without a single word from her. The silence was unnerving, but I interpreted it as a sign of surrender. I returned to my demanding schedule at the logistics firm, pouring my energy into managing complex shipping routes and trying to rebuild my depleted savings account. The memory of the Arctic reroute became a source of quiet, grim satisfaction. That satisfaction evaporated entirely on a Tuesday afternoon in early January. I was walking through the crowded marble-tiled lobby of my office building in Pioneer Square, carrying a stack of shipping manifests and a fresh cup of coffee. The lobby was bustling with corporate professionals, hurrying back from their lunch breaks, shaking the persistent Seattle drizzle off their umbrellas. "Excuse me, Abigail," a voice called out, cutting through the ambient noise of the lobby. I turned around. A man in a nondescript gray suit stood a few feet away holding a thick, heavy manila envelope. He did not look like a courier or a vendor. He possessed the tired, practiced efficiency of a process server. "Yes," I replied, my brow furrowing in confusion. The man stepped forward and thrust the thick envelope toward my chest. I instinctively reached out to grab it before it hit the floor, shifting the shipping manifests awkwardly to my left arm. "You have been served," he stated flatly. He did not wait for a response. He turned on his heel and disappeared into the crowd of professionals flowing toward the revolving doors. I stood in the center of the busy lobby, the heavy envelope resting on top of my paperwork. My heart rate spiked, a sudden cold rush of adrenaline flooding my system. I walked over to a leather bench near the security desk and sat down. I set my coffee aside and tore open the flap of the envelope. I pulled out a stack of dense, intimidating legal documents. The paper bore the official seal of the King County Superior Court. Diane had not retreated into silence to lick her wounds. She had spent the last 3 weeks orchestrating a devastating, aggressive counterattack. She had retained the services of a high-priced predatory civil litigator based in downtown Seattle. I scanned the first page of the lawsuit, the complex legal jargon blurring together before the sheer magnitude of the allegations solidified in my mind. Diane was not just suing me to recover the cost of the emergency flights. She was launching a full-scale legal assault designed to ruin me. The lawsuit alleged severe emotional distress, claiming my actions had inflicted deep psychological trauma upon her and her children. It claimed substantial financial damages, demanding restitution for the exorbitant last-minute flights from Alaska, the subsequent therapy bills, and the humiliation she suffered begging for wire transfers. But the most terrifying allegation was buried on the second page. The lawsuit accused me of reckless endangerment. Diane's attorney argued that by intentionally rerouting passengers lacking adequate winter survival gear to a remote sub-zero Arctic environment, I had knowingly placed their lives in imminent physical danger. The brief painted me as a malicious, unstable individual who utilized airline loopholes to execute a dangerous, premeditated attack against my own family. I stared at the documents, the blood draining from my face. The bustling noise of the Pioneer Square lobby faded into a dull, terrifying roar. The initial righteous joy of my retaliatory reroute evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, suffocating anxiety. I had executed a brilliant logistical trap, but in doing so, I had inadvertently handed Diane the exact ammunition she needed to drag me into a legitimate, terrifying legal nightmare. I understood enough about the civil justice system to recognize the gravity of the situation. This was not a minor disagreement that could be resolved with a quick mediation session. Civil suits of this magnitude were designed to be wars of attrition. They required months, sometimes years of grueling discovery periods, exhausting depositions, and endless legal filings. Diane had likely secured her aggressive litigator on a contingency basis, promising him a percentage of the massive damages she was demanding. She had nothing left to lose. Her husband's business was bankrupt, her reputation was severely damaged, and her financial situation was catastrophic. She was a cornered animal willing to burn everything down to secure a payday. I, on the other hand, had everything to lose. Defending myself against these allegations would require retaining my own civil defense attorney. The retainer fees for a competent lawyer in Seattle would easily eclipse the $6,000 Diane had originally stolen from me. I was already struggling to rebuild my savings after paying the brutal out-of-pocket fare differences to secure the Alaskan reroute. The impending legal bills threatened to bankrupt me entirely. Furthermore, the accusation of reckless endangerment carried severe implications. If Diane's attorney successfully proved that my actions constituted a deliberate attempt to inflict physical harm, the financial judgment against me could be astronomical. I could be forced to liquidate my assets, garnish my wages, and carry a crippling debt for the rest of my adult life. I gathered the heavy stack of legal documents and shoved them back into the manila envelope. I picked up my cold coffee and my shipping manifests, my hands trembling slightly. I rode the elevator up to my office, the claustrophobic space mirroring the tightening reality of my situation. Diane had successfully shifted the battlefield. She had taken her initial theft, a clear-cut case of fraud, and buried it under a mountain of civil allegations, focused entirely on my reaction. She was attempting to manipulate the legal system to portray herself as the victim of a malicious attack, using her stranded, shivering children as props in her narrative of distress. I sat at my desk, staring blindly at my computer screen. The glowing icons representing cargo ships moving across the Pacific offered no distraction. The logistics of international shipping felt trivial compared to the looming legal machinery preparing to grind my life into dust. I was facing a protracted, agonizing war against my own aunt, a woman whose profound entitlement had blinded her to her own culpability. I needed to find a defense attorney. I needed to gather every piece of documentation, every bank statement, and every email connecting Diane to the initial theft. I was preparing to fight for my financial survival, but I was terrifyingly aware that defending myself against the lawsuit was only half the battle. The true collateral damage of Diane's legal assault was about to strike much closer to home, fracturing the one relationship I had fought so desperately to protect. The legal paperwork had been served, but the deepest emotional blow was preparing to walk directly through my front door. The anxiety of the impending lawsuit sat heavy in my chest for the rest of the week, a dull, persistent ache that made focusing on shipping manifest nearly impossible. I spent my lunch breaks frantically researching civil defense attorneys in Seattle, balking at the exorbitant retainer fees required just to schedule an initial consultation. The reality of the financial hemorrhage I was facing was terrifying, but the legal threat was quickly overshadowed by a much deeper, more profound fracture. On Saturday afternoon, my mother knocked on the door of my apartment. I had not spoken to her since the day Diane boarded the flight. I had avoided her calls, knowing that the fallout from the Arctic reroute would place her squarely in the middle of a vicious family war. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, bracing myself for a tense conversation. My mother looked exhausted. The deep lines around her eyes were more pronounced, and her shoulders slumped with a heavy, visible sadness. She stepped into my living room, refusing the offer of coffee or tea. She sat on the edge of my sofa, wringing her hands nervously. "Abigail." She began, her voice tight and wavering. "Diane called me last night. She told me about the lawsuit. She told me everything that happened in Alaska." I stood by the kitchen counter, crossing my arms defensively. "Mom Diane stole my frequent flyer miles. She stole the vacation I spent 2 years saving for you. She committed credit card fraud. She is a thief." "I know she did a terrible thing," my mother replied, looking down at her hands. "I know she was wrong to take those tickets. But Abigail, what you did..." She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with tears. She was not looking at me with support or understanding. She was looking at me with profound disappointment. "You sent them to the Arctic Circle," she whispered, the horror stark in her voice. "You stranded your uncle and your cousins in sub-zero temperatures with no winter clothes. They had to sleep on the floor of a freezing airport terminal. Diane said the kids were terrified. She said Greg could not stop shivering. I felt a sharp, jagged pang of guilt pierce through my defensive armor. Hearing the reality of the situation spoken aloud by my mother, stripped of the initial adrenaline and vindication, reframed the retaliation. "She stole from us, Mom," I argued, my voice cracking slightly. "She drained my accounts to play rich for her friends. I used the airline system to hold her accountable because the bank refused to help me." "Accountable!" My mother echoed, a hard, unfamiliar edge entering her tone. "You did not hold her accountable, Abigail. You were cruel. You enacted a disproportionate, malicious revenge. 2 wrongs do not make a right. You could have just canceled the tickets. You could have fought her in small claims court. Instead, you deliberately placed your own family in physical danger just to prove a point." The accusation hit me with physical force. My mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise me, the woman I had worked so hard to reward with that tropical vacation, was actively condemning my actions. She was not defending Diane's theft, but she was fundamentally rejecting my method of justice. "You are tearing this family apart," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "Diane says she will never speak to me again unless you pay her damages. She says I raised a monster. I just wanted peace, Abigail. I just wanted my family to be okay." I stood paralyzed by the kitchen counter. The intense, agonizing guilt washed over me, drowning the last remnants of my righteous anger. I looked at my mother weeping on my sofa, grieving the complete fracture of her family structure. I wondered in that quiet, devastating moment if I had crossed a moral line. I had allowed my fury to dictate a brutal retaliation, and in doing so I had inflicted profound collateral damage on the people caught in the crossfire. Winning a battle against toxic family members often meant losing the larger war for peace. My mother left my apartment an hour later, leaving behind a suffocating silence. The emotional divide between us felt vast and unbridgeable. I had protected my finances, but I had alienated my only true ally. The emotional turmoil was soon compounded by a terrifying escalation on the legal front. Later that week, I attended a preliminary mediation session mandated by the civil court. Because I had not yet secured the funds to retain a defense attorney, I was forced to attend the session alone, proceeding pro se. The mediation took place in a sterile conference room in a downtown legal complex. Diane did not attend. She sent her aggressive civil litigator, a slick, fast-talking man named Mr. Vance, who operated with the ruthless efficiency of a shark smelling blood. He sat across from me at the long conference table, spreading a thick stack of printed emails, transaction logs, and medical bills detailing Diane's alleged emotional trauma. He did not attempt to negotiate. He intended to intimidate me into a rapid, unconditional surrender. "Ms. Abigail," Mr. Vance began, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. "My client is seeking $30,000 in damages plus the immediate reimbursement of her legal fees. Given the malicious nature of your actions, I strongly advise you to accept this settlement offer today." "I am not paying her a dime," I countered, keeping my voice steady despite the frantic hammering of my heart. "She initiated this entire ordeal by committing credit card fraud and stealing my frequent flyer miles. She is a thief." Mr. Vance smiled, a cold, predatory stretching of his lips. "The alleged theft is a separate civil matter which you are welcome to pursue at your own expense. However, my client's current lawsuit focuses entirely on your retaliatory actions, and frankly, civil damages are the least of your concerns." He leaned forward, pulling a specific document from his stack. He slid it across the table toward me. "During our discovery phase, we reviewed the airline transaction logs detailing your modification of the itinerary," he stated, his voice dropping into a low, threatening register. "Are you familiar with Title 18, Section 32 of the United States Code regarding the unauthorized disruption of a commercial flight manifest?" I stared at the document, the dense legal jargon blurred together. "By intentionally manipulating the routing of ticketed passengers without their consent, causing them to be transported to an unintended destination, you have potentially committed a federal offense," Mr. Vance explained, delivering the threat with brutal precision. "This statute carries severe penalties, including significant fines and potential federal incarceration. If you do not accept our civil settlement today, my firm is fully prepared to forward this evidence to federal aviation authorities and push for a criminal indictment." The blood drained completely from my face. The sterile conference room seemed to tilt. A federal offense, incarceration. I was not just facing bankruptcy, I was facing the terrifying prospect of a criminal record. I could not speak. The threat paralyzed my vocal cords. I gathered my paperwork, stood up on trembling legs, and walked out of the mediation room offering no response to the settlement demand. I drove home in a state of sheer blinding panic. Diane had not just shifted the battlefield. She had escalated the war to a nuclear level. She was using the threat of federal prison to extort $30,000 from me. I had attempted to outsmart a narcissist, and in doing so, I had seemingly handed her the exact weapon she needed to destroy my life. I spent the next 2 days trapped in my apartment, sick with anxiety. I could not sleep. I could barely eat. The looming threat of federal authorities investigating my actions consumed my every thought. On the third night, driven by sheer desperation, I opened my laptop and began frantically researching the specific federal statute Mr. Vance had cited. I pored over dense legal databases and aviation law forums, searching for any precedent, any loophole that could offer a defense. It was 3 o'clock in the morning when I finally found the clarification. I was reading through a detailed legal analysis of Title 18, Section 32, focusing on the specific definitions of unauthorized manipulation. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, tracing the lines of text with my finger. I stopped. I read the paragraph again, my heart leaping in my chest. The statute Mr. Vance had aggressively brandished in the mediation room was indeed a serious federal law, but the scope of its application was highly specific. The law was drafted to prosecute commercial airline employees, contractors, or unauthorized hackers who illicitly bypassed security protocols to alter flight manifests for malicious purposes. Crucially, the statute explicitly did not apply to an account holder utilizing administrative privileges to modify an itinerary booked under their own authenticated profile. Because Diane had used my frequent flyer account to book the tickets, the overarching reservation remained legally tethered to my administrative profile. I had not bypassed security. I had logged in using my own credentials and utilized the modification tools provided by the airline portal. Mr. Vance's terrifying federal threat was a complete fabricated bluff. It was a classic legal red herring designed to panic an unrepresented, legally inexperienced opponent into a hasty, expensive surrender. He had banked on my ignorance of federal aviation statutes to extort the $30,000 settlement. I sagged back against my chair, releasing a long, shuddering breath. The suffocating weight of potential federal incarceration lifted, leaving behind a sharp, profound sense of relief. I had not committed a felony. I was still fighting a grueling civil battle, and the financial pressure was mounting, but the immediate threat of criminal prosecution was an illusion. I closed my laptop, a new cold determination settling in my chest. The red herring had failed. Diane and her ruthless attorney thought they could bully me into submission using fabricated threats. They believed my lack of legal representation made me an easy target. They were wrong. The pressure was intense, but I was preparing to shift from a defensive posture to a highly targeted offensive strategy, and the next phase of discovery would reveal a truth Diane desperately wanted to keep hidden. The relief of discovering the legal red herring provided a much-needed surge of momentum. Armed with the knowledge that I was not facing federal criminal charges, I took the offensive. I tapped into the remaining balance of an emergency credit line and finally retained my own civil defense attorney. She was a pragmatic, no-nonsense litigator named Ms. Sterling, who operated a small firm in downtown Seattle. I handed her the full scope of my research, the timeline of events, and the details of Mr. Vance's fabricated threat. She reviewed the case files, her expression grim but determined. "He was trying to scare you into a rapid settlement," Ms. Sterling confirmed, tossing the mediation notes onto her desk. "It is a predatory tactic, but unfortunately common when dealing with unrepresented defendants. Now that you have counsel, we are going to halt their momentum. We are scheduling a formal deposition. We need to get your aunt under oath and force her to justify her damages on the record." The deposition was scheduled for late February, nearly 3 months after the disastrous Arctic reroute. It took place in the neutral, sterile environment of a court reporter's office located in a generic glass tower near the courthouse. The room smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and stale coffee. I arrived early with Ms. Sterling. I took a seat near the window, bracing myself for the inevitable confrontation. Diane arrived 10 minutes late, accompanied by Mr. Vance. She did not look like the affluent, aggressively confident woman who had sneered at my travel brochure during the Sunday potluck. The stress of the ensuing months had visibly aged her. She wore a tailored suit, but the fabric hung slightly loose on her frame. The dark circles under her eyes were poorly concealed by heavy makeup, and her hands gripped her designer handbag with a white-knuckled tension. She took her seat across the long conference table, refusing to make eye contact with me. The court reporter swore her in the formal oath hanging heavy in the chilled air of the room. Mr. Vance sat beside her, projecting an aura of bored confidence, ready to object to any line of questioning that threatened his narrative of emotional distress. Ms. Sterling did not begin with aggressive, combative questions. She started slowly establishing the timeline of the initial booking and methodically laying out the financial facts regarding the frequent flyer account. Diane answered in short, clipped sentences, relying heavily on the coaching she had undoubtedly received from her attorney. She maintained the facade of the victim, claiming she was confused by the airline portal and believed the miles were a familial resource. Ms. Sterling let the weak justification slide into the official record, building a foundation of inconsistencies. Then she shifted her focus to the core of Diane's lawsuit, the claim of severe emotional distress and reckless endangerment. Mrs. Diane, you are currently suing my client for $30,000 in damages, claiming the reroute to Alaska inflicted profound psychological trauma upon you and your family. Ms. Sterling stated, her tone shifting into a sharper, more investigative gear. Can you explain why you felt entitled to utilize my client's saved credit card to secure this specific luxury vacation? Mr. Vance immediately raised a hand. Objection. Relevance. The method of initial payment is a separate civil matter. My client's current suit is focused entirely on the malicious endangerment she suffered during the retaliatory reroute. I will rephrase the question, Ms. Sterling countered smoothly, bypassing the objection. Mrs. Diane, you testified earlier that your husband's contracting business recently went bankrupt. You are currently facing severe financial hardship, yet you chose to incur a massive unapproved charge to secure first-class tickets to a luxury resort. Why was this specific vacation so urgent that it warranted unauthorized access to another person's accounts? Diane stiffened in her chair. The question hit a nerve she had been desperately trying to protect. She looked at Mr. Vance, seeking an intervention, but he remained silent, waiting for her to navigate the inquiry. We needed a break, Diane answered, her voice tight and defensive. We have been under immense pressure. We deserved one nice thing before we lost our house. Ms. Sterling leaned forward, pressing the advantage. There are many affordable ways to take a family break, Mrs. Diane. Why Hawaii? Why utilize stolen miles to secure a trip you clearly could not afford? What was the driving motivation behind this specific, desperate act of theft? You do not understand. Diane snapped, her composure beginning to fracture. Her voice rose, echoing sharply in the small conference room. You have no idea what we are dealing with at home. You just see the bankruptcy. You do not see the reality. Then explain the reality to the record. Ms. Sterling demanded, her tone relentless. Explain why securing a luxury vacation justified stealing from your niece. Diane stared at my lawyer, her chest heaving as her breathing grew rapid and shallow. The defensive anger that usually armored her personality suddenly crumbled. The affluent facade shattered completely, revealing the terrifying, desperate vulnerability she had been hiding for months. Because he is forgetting me, Diane cried out, the words tearing from her throat in a raw, ragged sob. The sudden visceral outburst stunned the room into silence. The court reporter's fingers paused over her stenography machine. Mr. Vance shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I sat back, the air rushing out of my lungs as the impact of her words landed. Diane buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she wept openly in the sterile conference room. The polished, entitled suburbanite vanished, leaving behind a terrified, broken woman. The bankruptcy is not the worst part, she sobbed, the words muffled behind her hands. Greg was diagnosed with early-onset dementia 6 months ago. The doctors say it is aggressive. He is losing chunks of time. He gets confused in his own house. The business failed because he could not remember how to draft the bids anymore. She lowered her hands, revealing a face streaked with tears and smeared makeup. She looked directly at me for the first time since entering the room. Her eyes were wide, filled with a frantic, agonizing grief. "He always talked about taking the kids to Hawaii before they graduated," she explained, her voice trembling. "I knew if we did not go now, he would never remember the trip. I knew his mind was slipping away. I saw your laptop open on the counter, and I saw the miles, and I panicked. I just wanted to give him one last beautiful, lucid memory with his family before he completely forgets who we are. I was desperate. I am so scared, Abigail. I am losing my husband." The silence in the deposition room was profound and heavy. The air felt thick, suffocating. I stared at my aunt, the woman I had despised for months, the woman I had intentionally stranded in the Arctic Circle. The anger that had fueled my retaliation evaporated, replaced by a jagged, agonizing pang of empathy. I remembered Greg sitting in the sunroom during the family potluck, looking gray and diminished, exhausted by a battle nobody else could see. I remembered his quiet, gentle demeanor, a stark contrast to Diane's abrasive personality. The realization that his mind was deteriorating, that his identity was slowly being erased by a relentless disease, was devastating. Diane was not a cartoon villain. She was not a calculating mastermind executing a malicious theft for pure greed. She was a terrified wife, watching the man she loved slip away, grasping wildly at straws to capture a single fleeting moment of joy before the darkness consumed him entirely. Her profound entitlement had been warped and amplified by a desperate, blinding grief. A heavy, crushing guilt settled over me. I had weaponized my logistics expertise to punish a thief, unaware that I was punishing a family already drowning in an invisible tragedy. I had stranded a man suffering from cognitive decline in a freezing, unfamiliar environment, compounding his confusion and fear. The urge to surrender was overwhelming. I looked at Ms. Sterling, preparing to speak, preparing to instruct my lawyer to drop our defense. I wanted to end the deposition, absorb the $6,000 financial loss, and let Diane win the civil suit out of sheer overwhelming pity. The moral high ground felt suddenly treacherous, and winning the legal battle felt like a hollow, cruel victory against a family already enduring the ultimate defeat. I was ready to wave the white flag and walk away from the wreckage. The heavy silence in the deposition room lingered, broken only by the muffled sounds of traffic bleeding through the thick glass windows. Diane sat slumped in her chair, a portrait of profound, devastating grief. I felt the physical weight of her confession pressing against my chest. The urge to capitulate, to absorb the financial hit and walk away, was a siren song. I looked at Ms. Sterling, my mouth opening to initiate a surrender to offer a settlement that would end this agonizing confrontation. Before I could speak, Diane reached into her designer handbag. She pulled out a small monogrammed handkerchief and began to carefully blot the tears from her face. I watched the transformation occur in real time. It was a terrifying, jarring shift. The raw, vulnerable wife weeping for her fading husband vanished, retreating behind the thick, familiar armor of her lifelong entitlement. She smoothed her tailored suit jacket, adjusted her posture, and lifted her chin. The profound sorrow in her eyes hardened into a cold, transactional resolve. She turned to her attorney. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice regaining its sharp, commanding edge, entirely devoid of the tremor that had been there just moments before. "I believe we have established the severity of the situation. Please reiterate our settlement demands for the record." Mr. Vance, who had been sitting quietly, seemingly surprised by his own client's emotional outburst, quickly recalibrated. He cleared his throat, leaning forward to address my lawyer. Given the profound distress inflicted upon my client during a period of acute, documented familial vulnerability, he began slipping effortlessly back into his predatory cadence. "We are maintaining our demand for $30,000 in compensatory damages, covering the cost of the emergency repatriation flights from Alaska, subsequent medical evaluations, and severe emotional trauma. Furthermore, we require immediate reimbursement of all legal fees incurred during this action." I stared at Diane, stunned by the whiplash. The empathy that had flooded my system just minutes prior evaporated, leaving behind a stark, chilling clarity. She was not asking for forgiveness. She was not expressing remorse for stealing my frequent flyer miles or charging $6,000 to my credit card. She was using her husband's tragic diagnosis as leverage. She was weaponizing his early onset dementia to justify grand larceny and to extort an additional $30,000 from her own niece. She fundamentally believed her grief entitled her to my financial ruin. She believed that because her life was collapsing, she possessed the right to dismantle mine, to soften her landing. I remembered sitting in my grandmother's living room at 16, watching Diane deploy this exact same tactic. When my cousin announced her engagement, Diane had maxed out her own credit cards trying to secure a lavish country club venue she could not afford. Instead of scaling back the wedding, she arrived at my grandmother's house weeping about the social humiliation she would suffer if the event was canceled. She weaponized her panic, manipulating my grandmother into cashing out the modest savings bond intended for my college tuition. Diane took the check, wiped her tears, and walked away entirely unconcerned that she had just subsidized a luxury party with my educational future. The pattern was lifelong and incurable. Sickness did not excuse theft, and grief did not justify financial extortion. Diane was demanding I act as the sacrificial lamb for her coping mechanism, and she expected me to offer my throat willingly. I looked at Ms. Sterling. The seasoned litigator was watching me closely, waiting for my directive. She recognized the emotional weight of the revelation, but she also recognized the predatory nature of the settlement demand. Ms. Sterling, I said, my voice steady, the tremor of empathy entirely gone. Yes, Abigail. Please inform opposing counsel that we are rejecting their settlement offer, I instructed, keeping my gaze fixed firmly on my aunt. We are rejecting it in its entirety. We will not pay $30,000. We will not pay $30. Diane's eyes widened, a flash of genuine shock breaking through her hardened facade. Abigail, be reasonable. She snapped, her tone dripping with patronizing condescension. You heard what we are going through. Greg needs specialized care. We need those funds. You have a corporate salary. You can absorb this. Do not be selfish. You stole from me, Diane. I countered, my voice low and uncompromising. You committed credit card fraud. You drained 2 years of my savings. I am sorry about Uncle Greg. I truly am. It is a devastating diagnosis. But his illness does not grant you a blank check to steal my property and then sue me when I take it back. It was not a theft. It was a family emergency. Diane argued fiercely, gripping the edge of the conference table. We are blood. You are supposed to help us. You did not ask for help, I stated, laying out the stark reality of her actions. You logged into my account from the shadows, changed my passwords, and booked first-class tickets to a luxury resort. You did not steal bread to feed your family, Diane. You stole a vacation to maintain an illusion of wealth for your country club friends. I stood up from my chair, ignoring Mr. Vance's immediate objection. I am done setting myself on fire to keep your facade intact, I declared, looking down at the woman who had exploited our family for decades. I will not be your sacrifice. I turned to Ms. Sterling. Prepare to file our counter-motions. Do whatever is necessary. We are taking this to court. Ms. Sterling nodded, a grim, satisfied smile playing on her lips. Understood. I gathered my coat and my purse, turning my back on Diane and her attorney. The deposition was over. The battle lines, momentarily blurred by the revelation of Greg's illness, were now permanently and irrevocably drawn. I walked out of the sterile conference room and into the bustling hallway of the glass tower, my heart pounding a steady, resolute rhythm. I had survived the initial shock of the lawsuit and the emotional manipulation of the deposition. I had refused to surrender to extortion masquerading as grief. But rejecting the settlement meant committing to a grueling, expensive legal war. Diane's attorney was aggressive, and despite the fraudulent nature of her initial theft, civil courts were unpredictable arenas where emotional narratives often swayed judicial opinions. I needed more than just a strong defense. I needed a devastating, offensive strategy. I needed to definitively prove that Diane's actions constituted a severe, undeniable crime, shifting the power dynamic from a messy familial dispute to a stark violation of federal law. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, my mind raced through the details of the initial theft, searching for the logistical flaw in Diane's execution. She had stolen the tickets digitally, and in the modern era, every digital action leaves a trace. I needed to find the specific digital footprint that would elevate her crime from a simple credit card dispute to a federal offense, and I knew exactly where I had to start digging. The corporate logistics skills I utilized every day to track cargo across oceans were about to be deployed to track a thief across the internet, and the upcoming discovery phase would provide the exact ammunition I required. The fallout from the deposition was immediate. Diane's attorney, furious that his emotional extortion tactic had failed to produce a $30,000 settlement, launched a barrage of aggressive discovery requests. He demanded access to years of my financial records, my personal emails, and my employment history, attempting to build a narrative that I was financially unstable and prone to malicious behavior. The sheer volume of the paperwork was designed to exhaust me and bankrupt me through Ms. Sterling's billable hours. I refused to be crushed under the weight of his bureaucratic assault. I had built a career analyzing complex international supply chains. I knew how to sift through massive amounts of data to find the critical failure points. I decided to turn the discovery process against them. If Mr. Vance wanted a paper trail, I would give him one that led directly to a federal indictment. I spent my evenings sitting at my dining room table surrounded by stacks of legal filings and bank statements operating on strong coffee and sheer, stubborn adrenaline. I directed Ms. Sterling to aggressively pursue the specific digital transaction logs related to the initial booking of the Maui tickets. I needed the exact metadata from the moment the theft occurred. Commercial airlines and major financial institutions track every digital movement with relentless precision. When a purchase is made, the system records the time, the date, the specific credit card authorization codes, and the unique Internet Protocol address of the device initiating the transaction. It took 3 weeks of legal wrangling and a court order to compel the airline to release the raw data, but Ms. Sterling finally secured the logs. It was a rainy Tuesday night when I opened the encrypted file containing the airline's internal reporting. The spreadsheet was dense, filled with thousands of lines of alphanumeric code. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, put on my reading glasses, and began to isolate the data associated with my frequent flyer account number on the specific Sunday the theft occurred. I scrolled through the mundane login histories, bypassing the routine checks I had made earlier that morning. Then I found it. The anomaly. At 4:12 in the afternoon, a new login event was recorded. The system flagged a massive deduction of frequent flyer miles, immediately followed by a $6,000 credit card authorization for taxes and booking fees. I traced my finger across the screen, following the row of data until I reached the final column. The IP address logged for that specific fraudulent transaction stared back at me. It was a fixed residential IP address. I opened a separate browser window and accessed a public IP geolocation database. I typed the sequence of numbers into the search bar and hit enter. The database processed the request, triangulating the digital footprint. A map appeared on the screen, dropping a red digital pin directly onto a residential neighborhood in Bellevue, Washington. I zoomed in on the map. The pin was sitting squarely on the roof of Diane and Greg's house. I had found the smoking gun. But tracing the location was not enough. I needed to tie the IP address to a specific device to eliminate any possibility of Diane claiming their home network had been hacked by a third party. I reviewed the device fingerprint data included in the airline logs. The system recorded the operating system and browser type used during the transaction. Device Apple iPad, operating system iOS 14.2. I leaned back in my chair, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. The memory of that chaotic Sunday potluck snapped into sharp focus. Diane had been pacing near the back door, arguing with her daughter on her phone. Greg had been asleep in the wicker armchair in the sunroom, and resting on the glass side table next to him was his silver iPad, the device he previously used for his contracting business. Diane had not used a sophisticated hacking method. She had simply picked up her husband's iPad connected to their home Wi-Fi network and robbed me while I was serving dinner in the next room. The digital trail was irrefutable, but the implications of that specific trail were far more devastating than a simple civil dispute. I pulled up the legal research I had compiled weeks ago when Mr. Vance had attempted to terrorize me with his fabricated federal flight manifest threat. During that late-night research session, I had familiarized myself with several actual federal statutes governing digital transactions. I opened a new search query focusing on the specific mechanics of the credit card charge Diane had executed. The airline's primary financial processing servers were located in Atlanta, Alaska. Diane had initiated the $6,000 fraudulent charge from an iPad located in Bellevue, Washington. The digital transaction crossed state lines. I read the text of Title 18 United States Code Section 1343, Wire Fraud. Whoever having devised or intending to devise any scheme or artifice to defraud or for obtaining money or property by means of false or fraudulent pretenses, representations or promises, transmits or causes to be transmitted by means of wire, radio, or television communication in interstate or foreign commerce, any writing, signs, signals, pictures, or sounds for the purpose of executing such scheme or artifice shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 20 years or both. I stared at the statute, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. By utilizing an internet connection to transmit a fraudulent credit card authorization across state lines to an out-of-state financial server, Diane had not just committed a local misdemeanor theft. She had triggered the jurisdiction of the federal government. She had committed wire fraud. This was not a red herring. This was not a bluff. This was a documented, verifiable felony carrying severe federal penalties. The leverage I needed had finally materialized, but I needed the final piece of the puzzle to secure the trap. I needed the bank to officially validate the theft. For nearly 3 months, the agonizing 90-day investigation mandated by my credit card company had been crawling forward in the background. The bank had classified the initial theft as a familial dispute, forcing me to carry the $6,000 debt while they conducted their glacial review. 2 days after I discovered the IP address logs, a thick envelope from the bank arrived in my mail. I tore it open, my hands shaking slightly. It was the formal resolution of the fraud investigation. The document was dense and bureaucratic, but the conclusion printed on the final page was stark and absolute. After a comprehensive review of the transaction logs, the provided police reports, and the IP address histories, the bank officially determined that the $6,000 charge was unauthorized. The investigation ruled in my favor. They formally classified the transaction as identity theft and credit card fraud. The provisional credit applied to my account was made permanent. I was officially absolved of the debt. The ruling meant the bank would now initiate a chargeback against the airline, and the airline, having rendered the service, would seek restitution directly from the individual who initiated the fraudulent charge. I sat at my dining room table surrounded by the physical proof of Diane's crimes. I had the airline logs proving the device and location. I had the federal statutes outlining the wire fraud, and I had the official bank ruling confirming the identity theft. Diane and her ruthless attorney believed they were fighting a war of attrition in civil court. They thought they could use Greg's tragic dementia diagnosis to extort a settlement from me. They had no idea I had just bypassed the civil arena entirely and gathered the ammunition required to trigger a federal indictment. I gathered the documents, placing the logs, the statutes, and the bank ruling into a pristine manila envelope. The anxiety that had plagued me for months evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical determination. I picked up my phone and dialed Ms. Sterling's office. It was time to request a final mediation hearing. It was time to slide the evidence across the table and watch Diane's entire legal strategy collapse under the weight of a federal felony. I arrived at Ms. Sterling's office on a gray Tuesday morning, carrying the manila envelope that held Diane's impending ruin. The final mediation hearing was scheduled for 1 o'clock that afternoon. We had spent the previous week meticulously organizing the evidence the airline IP logs the bank's official fraud ruling, and a drafted unsent report outlining the federal wire fraud violations addressed to the United States Postal Inspection Service. The trap was primed, the leverage was absolute, and I was ready to execute the counterstrike. But civil litigation is rarely a straightforward march to victory. Just hours before we were scheduled to sit across the table from Mr. Vance, a seismic event occurred that fractured Diane's entire legal strategy, and I did not have to lift a finger to trigger it. The plot twist arrived via an unexpected phone call to Ms. Sterling's office line. I was sitting in the leather guest chair across from her desk, reviewing the timeline notes for the mediation, when her assistant buzzed in. "Ms. Sterling, I have a young man on line 2. The assistant stated, her voice tight with professional confusion. "He says his name is Matthew, and he claims he is the opposing plaintiff's son. He is insisting on speaking with you or Abigail immediately." Ms. Sterling and I exchanged a sharp, surprised look. Matthew was Diane and Greg's oldest son, currently a junior at an expensive out-of-state university. He was one of the 2 college-aged children who had been dragged onto that freezing Alaskan tarmac in shorts and sandals. "Put him on speaker," Ms. Sterling instructed, leaning forward and pressing the button on her console. The line clicked open, carrying the faint echoing sound of a busy university quad in the background. "Hello," a voice said, sounding tense and exhausted. "Is Abigail there?" "I am here, Matthew," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "My attorney is also present and listening to this call." I know Matthew exhaled a ragged, frustrated breath. "I am sorry to call your lawyer's office, but my mother blocked your number on my phone, and I needed to reach you before this mediation thing happens today." "What is going on, Matthew?" I asked, the confusion deepening. We found out he stated bluntly, the anger vibrating through the speaker. My sister and I found out what she did. The admission hung in the quiet office. I glanced at Ms. Sterling. She raised an eyebrow, silently encouraging me to let him continue. Found out what exactly Ms. Sterling interjected, her lawyer instincts taking over to establish the parameters of his knowledge. "We found out she stole the miles," Matthew said, his voice rising in volume, fueled by a raw, profound humiliation. He explained how the facade had finally crumbled. For months, Diane had maintained a rigid narrative within their immediate family. She had told her children that the trip to Maui was a final desperate splurge paid for by maxing out an emergency credit card, a last-ditch effort to give their father a beautiful memory before his dementia worsened. She had painted me as a malicious, unstable cousin who had hacked the airline portal out of sheer spite to ruin their vacation. Her children had believed her. They had believed they were the victims of my unprovoked cruelty. They had spent months hating me for stranding them in the Arctic. But Diane's desperate need to control the narrative had been her undoing. Matthew had flown home to Bellevue for a long weekend to check on his father. He was using the family desktop computer in the home office to print an assignment for a class. Diane had left her email inbox open on the browser. She had been frantically communicating with Mr. Vance regarding the escalating discovery requests. Matthew saw an email thread bearing my name in the subject line. Curiosity overrode his respect for privacy. He opened the thread. He read the attached legal documents detailing the airline IP logs. He read the bank's initial fraud investigation notices. He saw the exact timeline of the theft laid out in stark, bureaucratic black and white. He realized that the luxury vacation they had been promised, the trip that had ultimately ended in an Alaskan nightmare, had not been funded by a desperate mother's credit card. It had been financed by a felony committed against his own cousin. "I confronted her last night." Matthew continued, the disgust evident in his tone. "She tried to deny it at first, and then she tried to justify it. She said she did it for Dad. She said she did it for us. She actually expected me to feel grateful that she committed identity theft to buy me a plane ticket." He paused, a heavy, jagged sigh echoing over the line. "I am so sorry, Abigail," he whispered, the arrogance of his upbringing entirely shattered. "I had no idea she stole from you. We thought you were crazy. We thought you just snapped. I feel sick knowing we boarded that plane using your money." "You were not complicit, Matthew," I said softly, the lingering resentment I held toward my cousins evaporating in the face of his genuine horror. "You did not know." "I know now," he replied firmly, "and I am not going to let her use me to extort you." The true impact of his discovery materialized in his next sentence. "Mr. Vance sent us affidavits to sign yesterday," Matthew explained. "Sworn statements detailing the severe emotional distress and psychological trauma we allegedly suffered in Alaska. He needed our testimony to secure the damages in the civil suit. He needed us to play the victims on the record." He paused, the sound of the university quad fading away. "I tore them up," he stated, his voice ringing with a cold, absolute finality. "My sister tore hers up too. We told her we refused to testify. We will not sign any documents supporting her lawsuit. We told her if she drags us into court, we will tell the judge exactly what we saw in those emails. We are officially withdrawing our support. She is on her own." The line went quiet. I stared at the speakerphone, stunned by the sheer magnitude of the internal collapse. Diane had built her entire legal strategy on the foundation of familial trauma. She had weaponized her stranded, shivering children as props in her narrative of distress, relying on their corroborating testimony to secure the $30,000 settlement. Without their affidavits, without their willingness to play the victims on the stand, her claim of severe emotional damage was hollowed out. More importantly, she had lost the only audience that truly mattered to her. She had stolen the tickets to maintain the illusion of wealth and success for her children. Now those same children viewed her with disgust and humiliation. The facade was completely destroyed, shattered not by an external legal attack, but by the weight of her own lies. Have you ever watched a lie collapse under its own weight? Drop a comment if you think Diane is about to learn the true cost of entitlement. Matthew ended the call a few moments later, apologizing one final time before hanging up. Ms. Sterling leaned back in her chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. She picked up her pen and tapped it against the manila envelope sitting on her desk. "Well," she mused, her eyes gleaming with tactical satisfaction, "opposing counsel is about to walk into this mediation hearing entirely blind. Mr. Vance believes he is negotiating from a position of emotional strength, unaware that his star witnesses have just mutinied, and his client is currently holding a lit stick of dynamite." She stood up and gathered her briefcase. "Let us go show them the evidence," she said. I stood up, feeling a profound, unburdened lightness in my chest. The anxiety that had plagued me for months was gone. I was walking into the mediation room, not just with the leverage of a federal wire fraud charge, but with the knowledge that Diane had already lost the war at home. The final confrontation was no longer a battle. It was simply the formal execution of her surrender. The corporate loophole had provided the ammunition, but her own arrogance had supplied the match, and the resulting explosion was going to be spectacular. The final mediation hearing took place in the same sterile glass-walled conference room downtown, where Diane had wept about Greg's failing memory just weeks prior. Ms. Sterling and I arrived exactly on time. We took our seats on one side of the long, polished oak table. I placed my hands flat on the surface, feeling none of the suffocating panic that had paralyzed me during the preliminary sessions. I was armored with the cold, hard certainty of the evidence resting in Ms. Sterling's leather briefcase. Diane and Mr. Vance arrived 5 minutes late, a deliberate theatrical display of power and unbothered confidence. Diane wore a pristine navy pantsuit, her hair meticulously styled, the heavy makeup hiding the exhaustion that must have plagued her since Matthew's confrontation the night before. She carried a posture of defiant entitlement, attempting to project the illusion that her family dynamic was entirely intact. She refused to look in my direction, staring straight ahead at the blank whiteboard on the far wall. Mr. Vance unpacked his files with an air of practiced arrogance. He arranged his pens and notepads, completely oblivious to the fact that his star witnesses had mutinied, and his entire case was built on a foundation of sand. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries, Ms. Sterling." Mr. Vance began leaning back in his chair and adopting his familiar predatory cadence. "The discovery phase has concluded. We have established the timeline of the retaliatory reroute and the severe distress inflicted upon my client's family. We are prepared to proceed to trial. However, to spare your client the profound embarrassment and inevitable financial ruin of a public judgment, we are willing to offer a final settlement opportunity today." He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "My client will accept $25,000 payable within 30 days and a signed non-disclosure agreement regarding the events in Alaska," he stated, presenting the reduced demand as a magnanimous concession. "Reject this, and we file the trial motions tomorrow morning." Ms. Sterling did not look at the settlement offer. She left the paper sitting untouched in the center of the table. She unclasped her briefcase with a sharp, echoing snap. Mr. Vance, Ms. Sterling replied, her voice cool and dangerously calm. "Your client's narrative of emotional distress relies heavily on the corroborating testimony of her children. Have you spoken with Matthew or his sister this morning?" Mr. Vance frowned, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. He glanced sideways at Diane. Diane stiffened, her jaw clenching, but she remained silent. "My client's children are deeply traumatized by your client's malicious actions." Mr. Vance bluffed, unaware he was walking into a trap. "Their sworn affidavits will be submitted during the trial phase. Their testimony will clearly demonstrate the reckless endangerment they suffered." "They will not be submitting affidavits," Ms. Sterling corrected smoothly, extracting a thick manila folder from her briefcase. "And they will not be testifying on your client's behalf." She placed the folder on the table, resting her hand on top of it. "We received a very illuminating phone call from Matthew this morning. Ms. Sterling continued watching Mr. Vance's confident posture begin to erode. He informed us that he and his sister have formally withdrawn their support for this lawsuit. They discovered that their mother did not finance their vacation through legitimate means, but rather by committing identity theft against their cousin. They are entirely unwilling to commit perjury to assist her in an extortion attempt. The color drained from Mr. Vance's face. He turned to Diane, his professional composure cracking. "Diane, is this true?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Have your children refused to cooperate?" Diane stared straight ahead, her face a rigid mask of denial. "They are just confused," she muttered through gritted teeth. "They are upset. They will fall in line when the time comes." "They will not fall in line, Diane," I interjected, speaking directly to my aunt for the first time since the hearing began. "Matthew read your emails. He saw the transaction logs. He knows exactly what you did, and he refuses to be complicit in a felony. Your illusion is broken." Mr. Vance scrambled to regain control of the narrative, attempting to salvage his crumbling leverage. "Even without their testimony, the fact remains that your client maliciously endangered my client," he argued, his voice rising in volume. "The retaliatory action is a separate issue from the initial financial dispute. The court will still recognize the emotional damages inflicted by the reroute to the Arctic. We still have a viable case." "You do not have a case, Mr. Vance," Ms. Sterling stated with absolute finality. "You have a client who is actively engaged in a documented federal crime." She slid the manila folder across the polished wood, stopping it directly in front of opposing counsel. "I strongly advise you to review the contents of that folder before you threaten my client with a trial again," she instructed. Mr. Vance hesitated, sensing the lethal weight of the documents. He opened the folder. Inside rested the official fraud ruling issued by my bank, confirming the $6,000 charge was unauthorized and classifying the transaction as identity theft. Beneath that lay the comprehensive airline transaction logs we had secured during discovery. Ms. Sterling did not wait for him to read through the dense paperwork. She narrated the execution, driving every nail into the coffin. "Those logs detail the specific Internet protocol address used to drain my client's frequent flyer miles and execute the fraudulent credit card charge." She explained, her tone sharp and uncompromising. "The IP address traces directly to a residential network in Bellevue, Washington, registered to your client's husband. Furthermore, the device fingerprint confirms the transaction was initiated using an Apple iPad operating on that specific network." Diane flinched visibly, her hands dropping below the table out of sight. The detailed digital footprint shattered any remaining deniability. "Because your client utilized an internet connection to transmit a fraudulent credit card authorization across state lines to the airline's financial servers." Ms. Sterling continued delivering the final, devastating blow. "Her actions fall under the strict jurisdiction of Title 18 United States Code Section 1343. Mr. Vance stopped reading. He stared blindly at the documents, recognizing the statute number instantly. "Wire fraud," Ms. Sterling clarified for the record. "A federal felony carrying severe penalties, including potential incarceration." The silence in the conference room was absolute. The arrogant, predatory energy that had defined Mr. Vance's strategy evaporated entirely. He looked at Diane, his expression morphing from professional annoyance to profound, unadulterated horror. He realized he had been aggressively litigating on behalf of a client who had committed a highly documented federal crime, potentially exposing his own firm to severe ethical and legal repercussions. Ms. Sterling tapped the final document in the folder. "That is a drafted, currently unsent report detailing the evidence of the wire fraud violations, prepared for submission to the United States Postal Inspection Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation," she stated. She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. "We are not negotiating a settlement today, Mr. Vance," she declared, outlining the uncompromising ultimatum. "We are offering terms of surrender. Your client will drop this civil lawsuit immediately with prejudice. She will sign a binding agreement assuming full liability for the original $6,000 credit card debt, preventing the airline from pursuing my client for restitution following the bank's chargeback. And finally, she will reimburse my client for every single dollar spent on legal defense fees associated with this frivolous action." I watched Diane. The smug, defiant entitlement that had armored her personality for decades drained completely from her face. Her rigid posture collapsed, her shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of her own actions. She looked older, diminished, and utterly trapped. "If she refuses these terms," Ms. Sterling concluded, her voice devoid of sympathy, "I will personally walk that report to the federal authorities this afternoon. The choice is hers: face bankruptcy through restitution or face a federal indictment." Mr. Vance did not posture. He did not attempt a counteroffer. He looked at his client, his professional detachment entirely replaced by urgent self-preservation. "Diane," he said, his voice low and urgent, carrying no room for debate, "you need to accept these terms immediately. If they file that report, I cannot protect you. You are looking at a potential federal prison sentence. You have to drop the suit today." Diane stared at the drafted federal report resting in the folder. The reality of the trap had finally snapped shut. She had attempted to use the civil justice system to punish me for exposing her theft, believing her grief entitled her to a payday. She had weaponized her stranded children and her husband's dementia. She had bullied, manipulated, and lied. Now she was cornered by the undeniable digital proof of her own arrogance. She had nowhere left to run. The illusion of wealth was gone. The loyalty of her children was gone. The leverage of her lawsuit was gone. She was entirely isolated, facing the catastrophic consequences of her lifelong entitlement. "I agree," Diane whispered, her voice barely audible, staring blankly at the polished wood table. "I will drop it. I accept the terms." She did not look at me. She did not offer an apology. She simply surrendered, crushed under the suffocating weight of the truth. I gathered my coat and walked out of the mediation room, leaving her alone with her attorney to navigate the wreckage of her own making. The legal battle was finally over, but the aftermath for Diane was just beginning, and the resulting fallout would alter the landscape of her life permanently. The ink on the settlement agreement was barely dry when the bureaucratic consequences of Diane's theft began to execute with ruthless mechanical precision. By accepting my terms to avoid a federal wire fraud indictment, Diane had legally assumed full liability for the unauthorized $6,000 credit card charge. She had bound herself to the debt, extinguishing her ability to contest the transaction through any financial institution. The bank, armed with my official fraud ruling and the subsequent legal admissions, initiated a rapid, aggressive chargeback protocol. They did not gently request restitution. They treated the situation as a recovery of stolen funds. Less than a week after the mediation hearing, the bank executed a direct sweep of Diane's primary checking account, instantly pulling the entire $6,000 sum to cover the fraudulent airline taxes. The financial timing was devastating. Diane and Greg were already operating on the razor-thin edge of insolvency following the collapse of his contracting business. They relied on a delicate, highly choreographed rotation of minimum payments and credit line transfers just to keep the lights on in their Bellevue home. The sudden, unannounced extraction of $6,000 completely shattered their fragile financial ecosystem. The sweep hit their account on the 28th of the month, 2 days before their massive, affluent suburban mortgage payment was automatically deducted. The mortgage payment bounced. The resulting cascade of overdraft fees, late penalties, and aggressive notices from their mortgage lender plunged Diane into immediate, catastrophic financial ruin. She could no longer hide behind designer handbags and leased luxury vehicles. The illusion of wealth she had guarded so fiercely, the very facade she had committed a felony to protect, evaporated entirely. The bank foreclosure notices began arriving in the mail, printed in stark, unforgiving black and white. But the financial destruction was only a fraction of the fallout. The emotional and familial collateral damage was far more profound. Diane's children, Matthew and his sister, returned to their out-of-state university, deeply traumatized by the revelation of their mother's actions. The knowledge that they had unknowingly participated in a crime, combined with the sheer humiliation of the Arctic ordeal, severed the trust between them. The family dynamic was irrevocably fractured. The children drastically reduced their communication with Diane, refusing to come home for holidays or school breaks. They cited their demanding academic schedules, but the underlying reason was transparent. They could not bear to look at the woman who had weaponized their vulnerability to extort their own family. Diane was left entirely isolated in a massive, echoing house she could no longer afford, forced to navigate the increasingly terrifying reality of Greg's deteriorating health without a support system. Uncle Greg's early onset dementia did not pause for legal battles or financial ruin. His condition progressed rapidly in the months following the lawsuit. The brief moments of lucidity became sparse, replaced by prolonged periods of intense confusion, anxiety, and frustration. He required constant, vigilant supervision. He began wandering out of the house at odd hours, getting lost in their own affluent subdivision. He could no longer manage his own medication or perform basic daily tasks safely. Under normal circumstances, a diagnosis of this magnitude would rally an extended family. Aunts, uncles, and cousins would coordinate care schedules, drop off meals, and provide respite for the primary caregiver. They would rally around the struggling spouse, offering a protective net of familial support. But Diane had systematically burned every bridge available to her. Her unyielding entitlement, her constant condescension toward her siblings, and the shocking, unapologetic nature of her theft had alienated the entire extended family. My mother, deeply scarred by the viciousness of the lawsuit and the manipulation involved, refused to engage with Diane beyond basic clinical text messages regarding Greg's medical updates. The rest of the relatives, having witnessed the spectacular collapse of her civil suit and hearing the rumors of the wire fraud leverage, maintained a cold, distant perimeter. They offered prayers and polite condolences, but they offered no tangible assistance. Diane was forced to shoulder the crushing, agonizing burden of Greg's care entirely alone. She spent her days trapped in the house managing the escalating chaos of a failing mind, while simultaneously fielding aggressive calls from debt collectors demanding payment for her exorbitant, unrecoverable legal fees. Mr. Vance, furious over the collapsed mediation and the lack of a contingency payout, relentlessly pursued Diane for his accumulated billable hours, adding another crushing layer of debt to her existence. Desperate for any source of liquid capital to fend off the impending foreclosure and appease the mounting collection agencies, Diane was forced to make a decision she previously would have considered a fate worse than death. She was forced to enter the hourly workforce. Her lack of recent applicable work experience and the desperate need for immediate income severely limited her options. She could not secure a comfortable salaried office position. She needed a job that hired quickly and offered flexible shifts to accommodate Greg's erratic care schedule. Diane, the woman who had spent decades curating an image of effortless, unbothered wealth, accepted a part-time position as a front-end cashier at an upscale organic grocery store located in the heart of her own Bellevue neighborhood. The poetic justice of her new reality was sharp localized and agonizingly visible. She was issued a generic green apron and a plastic name tag. She was assigned to register 4, required to stand on an anti-fatigue mat for 6 hours a day, scanning barcodes and bagging groceries. The true torture of the position was the clientele. The grocery store catered specifically to the affluent residents of Bellevue, the exact same demographic Diane had spent her entire adult life trying to impress. Every shift she worked, Diane was forced to scan expensive artisan cheeses, imported wines, and organic produce for the women she used to invite to her catered holiday parties. She had to bag groceries for the neighbors she used to gossip with at the local country club. She had to endure their thinly veiled stares of pity and confusion as they realized the woman scanning their avocados was the same woman who used to drive a brand-new Range Rover through their subdivision. Through the relentless suburban grapevine, I heard stories of her humiliation. I heard how she kept her head down, avoiding eye contact, her face flushed dark red as she mechanically processed the transactions. I heard how the women in the neighborhood whispered about her downfall, dissecting the rumors of bankruptcy and family estrangement while unpacking their groceries. She had stolen my frequent flyer miles because she could not bear the thought of losing her status. She had risked federal prison because she believed she was entitled to a luxury vacation. She had tried to destroy me in civil court because her ego demanded retribution. Now her punishment was custom-built to exploit her deepest insecurities. She was trapped in a glass cage of her own making, publicly stripped of her affluent facade, forced to serve the very people she considered her peers. She was a minimum wage employee, scanning the items she could no longer afford to buy, carrying the heavy, solitary burden of a dying husband and an alienated family. She had sought a tropical paradise, and instead she had engineered a bleak, punishing reality from which there was no escape. The scales of justice had balanced themselves with a brutal, unforgiving symmetry, leaving me to finally step away from the wreckage and reclaim the peace I had fought so fiercely to protect. The resolution of the legal conflict did not bring a sudden cinematic explosion of joy. The restitution of my stolen property felt less like a triumph and more like the exhausted quiet following a brutal storm. Diane's signature on the settlement agreement effectively ended the war, with the threat of federal wire fraud neutralizing her civil suit. The bureaucratic machinery slowly began to reverse its course, the bank satisfied by the settlement terms, and Diane's assumption of the debt officially closed my fraud claim. The grueling 90-day investigation was terminated, and my credit report was scrubbed clean of the massive high-interest balance. I was no longer carrying the crushing financial weight of my aunt's entitlement. More importantly, the airline's fraud department reviewed the bank's official ruling. Acknowledging that the original miles were stolen via unauthorized access to my loyalty profile, they initiated a complex internal restoration process. It took 6 weeks of tedious emails and escalation tickets, but eventually my frequent flyer balance was fully replenished. The staggering sum of miles I had hoarded over 2 years of grueling corporate travel reappeared on my digital dashboard, sitting there like a quiet numerical testament to survival. The funds were secure, the legal threat was neutralized, and the immediate crisis had passed. But the emotional landscape of my life had been fundamentally altered. The family dynamic was not just fractured, it was permanently severed. My mother, deeply scarred by the viciousness of the lawsuit and the horrifying reality of her sister's actions, retreated into a protective shell. We no longer hosted large Sunday potlucks. The holidays were quiet, solitary affairs, lacking the chaotic, loud energy that had defined my childhood. We did not discuss Diane. We did not ask about Greg's declining health. The silence regarding that side of the family became a heavy, unspoken rule between us, a boundary erected to protect what little peace we had left. It took a full year for the dust to settle, for the anxiety to finally bleed out of my nervous system, and for the grueling rhythm of my logistics job to feel normal again. When the anniversary of the initial theft approached, I logged back into the airline portal. I did not ask my mother for permission. I did not make a grand announcement at a family dinner. I simply selected the dates, applied the restored frequent flyer miles, and paid the booking fees using my secure, heavily monitored credit card. I booked 2 first-class tickets to Maui. I printed the itinerary and drove to my mother's house in the suburbs. I found her in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, the house smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and quiet solitude. I set the printed pages on the granite island, right where my laptop had been sitting a year ago. "We are going, Mom," I stated, my voice leaving no room for argument or hesitation. "Pack your bags." The trip was everything I had envisioned during those long, rainy Seattle commutes. The flight was flawless, the service impeccable, a stark contrast to the anxiety-ridden tracking I had monitored the year before. We landed in Kahului, the warm tropical air wrapping around us the moment we stepped off the plane. We spent 10 days immersed in the vibrant, restorative beauty of the island. We drove the winding, dramatic curves of the Hana Highway, watching waterfalls spill into emerald pools. We ate fresh seafood at small roadside stands and drank strong Kona coffee on the lanai of our resort, watching sea turtles navigate the clear, shallow reefs. For 10 days, the stress of corporate logistics and the lingering trauma of familial betrayal felt thousands of miles away. But the victory was complex. The vacation was undeniably beautiful, but it was not the carefree, untethered joy I had anticipated. The absence of the extended family was a heavy, quiet ghost that followed us along the beaches. In the past, a trip of this magnitude would have been a communal event, documented, and shared a point of collective pride. Now it was a solitary celebration, a private victory secured through brutal retaliation and severed ties. I watched my mother walk along the shoreline, the warm Pacific water washing over her tired feet, and I could see the subtle, lingering sorrow in her posture. She was enjoying the paradise I had promised her, but she was carrying the grief of a shattered family tree. On our final evening in Maui, we decided to watch the sunset from the beach directly in front of our resort. We claimed 2 lounge chairs facing the western horizon, the sky preparing to ignite into a brilliant display of orange and bruised purple. As the sun began to dip below the horizon line, the tropical heat rapidly dissipated. A sudden, uncharacteristically chilly wind blew in off the ocean, carrying a sharp, damp edge that cut through our light summer clothing. My mother shivered, rubbing her bare arms, unprepared for the rapid drop in temperature. I reached into the large canvas beach bag resting beside my chair. Before we left Seattle, I had packed the heavy, expensive winter coat I had bought for her the previous year, the gift I had given her as a promise that we would escape the Pacific Northwest drizzle. I had thrown it into the suitcase at the last minute, an instinctual logistical precaution against unpredictable airport climates. I pulled the heavy insulated coat from the bag. I stood up and draped it gently over my mother's shoulders. She looked up at me, surprised, pulling the thick, warm fabric tightly around her chest. The coat immediately blocked the biting ocean wind, enveloping her in a protective layer of warmth. "Thank you, sweetheart," she murmured, resting her cheek against the soft collar. I sat back down, watching the final sliver of the sun disappear beneath the waves. The symbolism of that moment was quiet, profound, and inescapable. That winter coat represented the genuine, enduring protection of true loyalty. I had worked grueling hours to purchase it, a tangible manifestation of my commitment to her comfort and security. It was designed to shield her from the bitter, relentless cold of Seattle, and now it was keeping her warm against an unexpected chill on a tropical beach. It stood in stark, devastating contrast to Diane's superficial greed. Diane had stolen a luxury vacation to project an illusion of warmth and wealth, prioritizing her own status over the basic security of her family. Her entitlement had ultimately stranded her children in the freezing, unforgiving expanse of the Arctic tundra, lacking any protection against the brutal elements. She had chased a mirage of paradise and engineered a nightmare of ice and isolation. I had secured my future, recovered my stolen assets, and delivered the tropical escape I had promised. I had successfully defended myself against a parasitic attack. But staring out at the darkening ocean, I reflected on the profound, agonizing cost of drawing those hard, uncompromising boundaries. I had protected my peace, but achieving that peace required me to unleash a corporate machine that systematically dismantled my uncle's final lucid months and forced my aunt into a humiliating minimum-wage existence. I had exposed the ugly, rotting foundation of our family dynamic, and the resulting explosion had leveled the entire structure. I realized then that drawing a hard line in the sand does not just keep toxic people out, it alters the landscape of your life permanently. You cannot heal a family by letting them break you, but surviving the fracture leaves a permanent scar. I protected my peace, but peace often requires leaving people behind. If this story made you evaluate the cost of your own family boundaries, hit subscribe to Sophie Tells Stories. Remember, you cannot heal a family by letting them break you, and sometimes the only way to survive the cold is to learn how to build your own fire. In the quiet hours of the night when the house finally settles and the glow of screens fades into darkness, many of us are left alone with the heavy, unspoken questions of parenthood. We look at our sleeping children and wonder if we are doing enough. In modern American culture, the pressure to provide a flawless, curated life for our families is immense. We are surrounded by a society that often equates successful parenting with the accumulation of status symbols, luxury experiences, and the desperate, breathless race to keep up with the neighbors. We want to pave the roads for our children, smooth out their rough edges, and cushion their every fall. But the story of Abigail and Aunt Diane is not merely a drama about stolen frequent flyer miles and a flight rerouted to the frozen Arctic. From the perspective of a spiritual practitioner observing the current landscape of our society, it is a profound, cautionary parable. It holds up an unforgiving mirror to a deeply ingrained destructive pattern in modern families, the tragic confusion between truly loving a child and merely enabling their ego. If we look at the collapse of Diane's family through a lens of wisdom, morality, and resilience, there is a vital transformative message here for anyone striving to raise grounded children in a complex world. Consider the illusion of material inheritance. Diane's ultimate downfall was rooted in a spiritual sickness that plagues many affluent suburbs, the belief that a superficial experience was more valuable than her own integrity. She believed that to be a good mother to her college-age children, She had to maintain an illusion of wealth, even if it meant committing a felony against her own niece to achieve it. Yet what happened when her children discovered the truth? Matthew and his sister did not care about the first-class seats to Maui. They were not grateful for the stolen luxury. They were crushed by their mother's profound lack of morality. The greatest inheritance you will ever leave your children is not a trust fund, a paid-off mortgage, or a pristine suburban image. It is an unshakable moral compass. Wisdom demands that we stop teaching our children that their worth is tethered to their lifestyle. We must teach them that an honest life lived with a quiet, clean conscience is infinitely more valuable than a kingdom built on deception. Then we must confront the weaponization of grief. Perhaps the most agonizing element of this story is Diane's attempt to use Uncle Greg's early onset dementia to excuse her theft. She used her very real, terrifying sorrow as a shield to justify her greed. In our society, we sometimes fall into the trap of believing that our pain exempts us from the rules of basic human decency. We think that because we are suffering, the world owes us a concession. As parents, we must model for our children how to navigate profound suffering with grace. Life will inevitably bring tragedy, illness, and financial hardship. These storms are unavoidable. But how we act in the center of those storms defines our spiritual maturity. We must teach our children that trauma does not give us permission to traumatize others. True morality is holding fast to your ethics, standing firm in your integrity, especially when you are terrified and hurting. Sickness does not excuse theft, and grief does not justify financial ruin. We must also examine the profound difference between true peace and mere pacification. Abigail's mother represents a very common enabling dynamic within traditional family structures. She was willing to overlook a devastating theft to avoid the discomfort of a fractured family, even going so far as to make Abigail feel guilty for holding Diane accountable. She demanded that the responsible, self-sufficient child set herself on fire to keep the chaotic, entitled family members warm. We cannot teach our children to be doormats in the name of family loyalty. There is a vast spiritual canyon between peace and pacification. Pacification is sweeping toxic behavior under the rug and demanding that the healthiest person in the room quietly absorb the damage. True peace requires justice, truth, and accountability. We must raise resilient children who understand that setting a hard boundary against a toxic relative is not an act of cruelty. It is a sacred act of self-protection. Fairness does not mean making sure everyone is equally comfortable. It means ensuring everyone is held to the exact same standard of honesty. At the end of the narrative, Abigail sits on the warm sand of a Hawaiian beach. She has secured her financial future and delivered the dream she promised her mother. But she feels the heavy, quiet ghost of the family she had to sever. She protected her peace, but it came with a profound, agonizing cost. Spiritual growth is rarely neat and tidy. It does not often look like a triumphant cinematic victory. We must prepare our children for the reality that doing the right thing is often a lonely, painful endeavor. Healing a generational curse, whether it is entitlement enabling or financial manipulation, requires immense courage. We must teach our children that it is okay to mourn the family they wish they had while fiercely protecting the life they have built. We explore these complex hidden truths of human nature because storytelling is how we heal. If you find yourself reflecting on your own life, your own boundaries, and the dynamics of the people you love through these narratives, I invite you to join our community. Subscribe and follow the channel Sophie Tells Stories. We share these parables not just to entertain, but to hold up a mirror to the shared human experience, helping us all navigate the difficult, beautiful journey of raising families and finding our own truth. As we navigate the endless complexities of modern American life, the ultimate goal of parenting should not be to engineer a flawless, pain-free, picture-perfect reality for our children. The goal is to raise spiritually sovereign adults who can look at a complex, often unfair world and respond with unyielding integrity. Imagine for a moment the quiet rooms of your own home. Years from now, the posters will fade, the trophies will gather dust, and the children who once slept down the hall will be out in the world making choices that ripple through the lives of others. What are you packing in their invisible suitcases before they go? Are you packing the fragile illusion that they are untouchable, that the world owes them comfort at the expense of others? Or are you packing the quiet, heavy grace of accountability? We spend our entire lives trying to build homes that will shelter our families from the storm. But perhaps the storm is not something to be avoided. Perhaps the storm is simply the test of the foundation we laid. And when the wind finally howls and the rain begins to fall, we are left to wonder, did we teach them how to hide, or did we teach them how to stand?